Hello. Welcome to the History Before Sleep channel. Tonight, we are setting sail together toward the most colossal stage history has ever seen, those endless open oceans. Just imagine those old times when satellites didn't draw coastlines millimeter by millimeter, and engines didn't erase distances. People hopped into wooden boats and set sail into the unknown, moving forward trusting only the wind, the stars, and their memories. Actually, every ocean expedition was a wager made with the planet itself. Survival depended entirely on patience, observing your surroundings well, and being able to listen to this world that doesn't speak in words. This is the story of that bizarre curiosity that refused to stay on land. The story of ships that got lost and the routes that changed the world forever when they returned, of ideas carried across the waves, and of knowledge gathered slowly, inch by inch, with a line dropped into the sea. Ocean expeditions completely reshaped maps, empires, science, and even the way we perceive time and distance. They connected continents, revealed hidden depths, and reminded humanity how small it actually is under that endless horizon. If you like these kinds of calm journeys, you can like the video and subscribe, or drop a thought that crosses your mind below. That way, other sleepy souls like you who want to shake off the exhaustion of the day can find this place too. But for now, forget all that. Loosen your shoulders completely and slow your breathing. Put all the stress of the day aside and let your thoughts set sail into the oceans along with the tides as you explore that long, legendary history of ocean expeditions. If you're ready, here we go. Ocean expeditions had already mapped a huge part of the world long before airplanes or anything were even around. For a large part of history, the shortest way to find out what was beyond the horizon was to directly set sail toward it. Sailors tracked coastlines by looking at the color of the water, the shape of the clouds, and the smell of land carried by the wind. They drew bays and shoals with charcoal, then, years later, they returned and corrected a curve they drew crookedly or added that reef to the map that almost cost them their lives. These journeys literally stitched continents together long before airplanes shrank distances. Maps turned empty spaces into routes, and routes turned into trade, migration, and wars. Port cities turned into massive crossroads where languages mixed and ideas spread even faster than cargo. Even mistakes literally had a real price. While a misplaced island could drag ships to disaster, a newly discovered strait could rewrite global politics from scratch. That world we see on the map at school was won slowly, the hard way, by overcoming a dangerous coastline every single time. Magellan's journey proved that the world could be circumnavigated solely by sea. When Magellan's expedition set out, it carried an incredibly bold idea: a ship could return to the exact point it left without ever touching land routes. But this journey later turned into a complete torment. What with storms, starvation, and tensions that turned the crew against each other, Magellan didn't live to see the end of this tour. But one of those battered ships finally completed the loop. This wasn't some flashy victory parade, it was literally a show of pure endurance. This tour forced sailors to face how massive the planet actually felt while in the middle of the ocean. It also proved a practical truth: oceans are connected to each other continuously as a single system, with passages you can find if you can survive long enough to look for them. This journey changed the way people imagined distance. It made the world feel both colossal in terms of the hardships endured and tiny in terms of the possibilities it offered, and it shifted global trade to the sea. Captain Cook's maps were so spot on that sailors used them for generations. Precision at sea isn't just a matter of pride, it's a matter of absolute life and death. Captain James Cook gained fame for mapping coastlines with a care that far exceeded his era. Whenever the sky allowed, he constantly took measurements, checked the route, and never moved on without correcting mistakes as if they were a debt that had to be paid. The result was maps that helped later sailors avoid reefs, find safe places to anchor, and enter unfamiliar ports with fewer surprises. This was crucial because the Pacific truly didn't forgive. Islands could be tiny, and a tiny miscalculation could push a ship into an endless drift where supplies ran out. Of course, these accurate maps also reshaped power. When a coastline is measured and named, it becomes much easier to claim, govern, and exploit it. That's why Cook's maps stand at a tense crossroads. While representing an extraordinary skill and patience on one hand, they became tools that opened the door to colonization on the other. The exact same line on paper could guide a ship and change an entire society. The Beagle journey completely reshaped biology from top to bottom after Darwin watched life at sea. The Beagle had actually set out to study coasts, but it was also carrying a young, restless naturalist taking constant notes. During his years spent at sea and on the coasts, Charles Darwin compared different animals and landscapes across massive distances. He saw patterns that felt too consistent to be just a coincidence. Animals that were the same but with slight variations lived on different islands, as if shaped by local conditions. Fossils provided clues that past worlds had different life forms, and living species seemed connected in ways people couldn't quite accept. The journey didn't give him a finished theory right away. It gave him questions that would never let him go. That long time he spent at sea left him with a wonderful margin of thought to reconsider his observations and weigh the evidence against old beliefs. Years later, when these ideas reached the public, they literally challenged the way people understood nature and humanity's place in the world. An expedition that set out to map coasts mapped out a brand new way of thinking. And the waves of this spread far, far beyond any port. The HMS Challenger expedition literally founded modern ocean science in a single journey. In the 19th century, the HMS Challenger set out on a mission that sounded almost impossible: to measure the ocean, take samples from it, and systematically describe the whole world. The crew dropped ropes to measure depth, dug up mud from the sea floor, and collected water from different layers. They gathered samples from places no one had physically visited before and sent them back to be studied. This work was very slow and relentless. Every station required patience, coordination, and the willingness to repeat the same tasks under harsh weather conditions. What made this journey revolutionary was its intention. They treated the sea as a branch of science that could be investigated with consistent methods, rather than relying on hearsay stories. The results of the Challenger filled volumes of encyclopedias and shaped the language of oceanography. Depth, temperature, chemistry, and life were tied together in a single story. It also changed expectations. After that journey, the ocean stopped being just a route used to get somewhere. It became a subject worth exploring on its own, full of mysteries requiring careful measurements. Greek explorers measured the seas, then debated where the world ended. That endless curiosity pushed Greek thinkers to see geography as a problem that could be tested. Sailors brought back distances, coastal shapes, and current reports. Then scholars tried to turn these scattered pieces into a coherent picture. Some tried to make early measurements of the Earth's size by using shadows and angles to figure out the scale. Others debated what lay beyond known waters, and whether the ocean was a boundary or a highway. These debates were seriously important because they shaped decisions. A captain choosing a route needed practical guidance, and a city planning trade needed believable maps. That thin tension between observation and speculation became a part of the exploration culture. Not every claim turned out right, but the method was very powerful: ask a question, gather whatever evidence you can, and accept that the sea might prove you wrong. This mindset, much more than any single journey made, helped expand horizons. Polynesian navigators crossed the open ocean using stars, waves, and seabirds. Across the Pacific, long before modern instruments, expert wayfinders treated the ocean as if it were a readable landscape. They memorized the rising and setting star paths with reliable patterns, and they matched these patterns with that rhythmic feel of the waves beneath the canoe. Different wave currents intersect, and trained bodies could feel this intersection like a hidden compass. Birds were also a great clue. Some species fly out to sea in the morning to feed and return toward land in the evening, which whispered to them the location of an island that was still not in their line of sight. Even clouds worked. Over shallow waters, sunlight could light up the underside of clouds in a way the open sea couldn't. This navigation business wasn't some made-up guessing game. It was a massive science passed down from generation to generation through stories, luck, and apprenticeship. When these men reached a tiny piece of land in an endless ocean, they proved something very profound. Human knowledge can be portable, it can be flawless, and it's brave enough to cross that massive void. Viking longships reached North America centuries before Columbus. Scandinavian sailors built ships that were light, fast, and flexible enough to survive harsh seas. These longships could surf the ocean waves and glide right into rivers, which meant exploration didn't just stop at the coast. Setting out from Scandinavia, they pushed to Iceland, then to Greenland, and from there further west, to a place they now call Lanzaux Meadows. Evidence shows a Viking presence in North America long before later European voyages. The place they reached wasn't magic. It was seafaring skill, timing, and the courage to travel into the unknown relying only on vague rumors as a guide. These journeys show how every new settlement became a stepping stone for the next. They also remind us that being first depends on which story you were taught. The Atlantic had been crossed and crossed again long before those famous headlines were made. The first deep soundings showed that the oceans were much deeper than imagined. For a long time, many people thought the sea floor was just right under their feet, a place a somewhat long rope could easily reach. The first depth measurements shattered this comfort. The crew lowered lines with weights on the end until the cord vanished in the dark, and the waiting time dragged on so long it felt surreal. When that line finally came back, it carried a number that made the sailors and scientists stare at each other in shock. The ocean wasn't a shallow pool. It was a vast, vertical world. This discovery changed everything. It affected where ships could safely anchor, how cables could be laid, and the idea of whether anyone could ever reach those dark depths. It also changed people's imagination. If the sea had this much depth, then it could hide landscapes like mountains and valleys, and it could host bizarre creatures adapted to a pressure no human body could withstand. A simple movement, dropping a line straight down, opened up a brand new dimension of the Earth. Exploration was no longer just about heading toward the horizon, it was about descending into another unseen planet inside the planet. Zheng Yi's treasure fleets overshadowed many European ships of that time. In the early Ming era, China launched massive state-sponsored voyages under the command of Admiral Zheng Yi. The fleets carried massive cargoes intended to impress, along with soldiers, interpreters, craftsmen, and diplomats. Passing through Southeast Asia and across the Indian Ocean, they visited ports where merchants already traded spices, textiles, and precious goods. These expeditions were as much about a show of power as they were about exploration. That massive fleet arriving in port could resolve disputes, build alliances, and showcase the emperor's power without firing a single cannon. Gifts flowed outward, and tribute returned, literally playing out a political theater on the water. Those massive ships baffled foreigners, and later stories about these ships became part history, part legend. Even without perfect measurements, the message is very clear: ocean exploration was never solely a European project. Great seafaring nations rose elsewhere too, and they used the sea as a massive stage for diplomacy, strategy, and trade. Phoenician sailors spread alphabets and trade to Mediterranean routes. Their world was stitched together by ports, islands, and sharp headlands that required constant attention. They carried metals, glass, and that famous purple dye that took a massive amount of labor to produce, which people desperately wanted. Yet, the most lasting cargo they left behind was even smaller than a jug, a practical writing system that sped up record-keeping, clarified agreements, and made copying messages easier. As ships traveled from port to port, sailors and merchants didn't just share products, they shared habits, words, and ways of valuing things. Over time, letters traveled much further than the sailors who first used them. A symbol carved on a piece of pottery in a coastal town could reappear in another town, shaped by new languages and new needs. Ocean routes literally became learning routes. Trade and communication grew shoulder to shoulder. And the sea helped carry an idea that could fit in the palm of a human hand to the world. Chinese sailors invented the compass and trusted it in pitch-black seas. A compass looks like a very simple tool until you imagine trusting it in those desperate moments when clouds hide the stars and land is nowhere to be seen on the horizon. The transition from finding your way looking at mountains and hills on the coast to true open water navigation required a new kind of trust in an object that pointed steadily while the world tossed you around with storms. Chinese sailors developed magnetic direction finding and used it to hold course when visibility dropped to zero. This reliability rewrote the nature of a journey. Ships could aim for much more distant targets with fewer stops, and merchants could plan routes without the obligation of keeping land in sight. The compass also changed the decision-making mechanism on board. It gave captains an unshakable reference when arguments flared up, when fear gripped everyone, or when storms erased all sense of direction. Ocean expeditions usually rely on these sorts of tiny inventions that make massive empty spaces manageable. A tiny floating or spinning needle could create that massive difference between drifting in circles for weeks in the sea and arriving exactly where you intended. Longitude remained a total deadly mystery until those precise marine clocks were invented. Knowing latitude, north-south, might save you from drifting to a hostile coast, but knowing longitude, east-west, could save you from completely disappearing. For centuries, sailors could only roughly guess their east and west positions, and on long journeys, tiny errors turned into massive dangers. A ship might think it was safely in the open sea, while reefs were actually waiting right in front of them in the dark. This uncertainty turned navigation into a stressful guessing game and made maps feel like false promises that could break at any moment. Governments offered rewards, scientists debated, but captains kept sailing anyway because trade and war wouldn't stop and wait for unsolved scientific problems. The most painful part of it was that the ocean didn't forgive honest mistakes. The crew might think they did everything right, but could crash into a rock that was supposed to be days away. Solving longitude didn't make the sea completely safe. It just made it readable. It turned the widest void in the world into a grid you could confidently measure. Medieval portolan maps captured coastlines with astonishing practicality. These maps weren't made just to look pretty, they were made entirely to get the job done. Portolan maps focused directly on coasts, ports, and the angles between them because when your ship was exhausted and that coastline was radiating danger, that was the only thing that mattered. The dense web of lines on them helped sailors stay on course from port to port, and their carefully drawn outlines reflected that ruthless experience accumulated over countless journeys. What makes them so striking is how modern they can look in places sailors knew well. You can feel the heavy hand of experience in every corrected bay and every carefully placed headland. The maps also showed priorities very clearly. While inland areas were generally empty or vague, the edge of the sea was extremely sharp and confident. This is a total turning point for expedition history. Ocean travel was now becoming systematic, shareable, and repeatable. A captain didn't just have to trust his memory or rumors in the tavern. The map could carry collective knowledge forward, and that expanded the circle of danger people dared to sail into. Early expeditions carried naturalists, artists, and translators alongside sailors. As ships reached further, leaders realized something: exploration wasn't just about arriving somewhere. It was about being able to return home with knowledge that could be shared. That's why many expeditions made room on board for people who didn't steer or furl sails. Naturalists collected samples, drew animal anatomies, and noted down living behaviors in their notebooks that couldn't survive a months-long journey in a barrel. Artists drew coastlines, local clothes, tools, and ceremonies with a reality that words struggled to describe. Interpreters made trade possible, prevented misunderstandings, and sometimes saved lives by spotting an approaching threat in time. This mixed crew team turned the ship into both a moving research station and a diplomatic embassy at the same time. Of course, this situation also created tension because those cramped and damp spaces didn't easily forgive different types of people. Still, the payoff was massive. When a ship returned home, it could change not just maps, but libraries, museums, and even state policies. Ocean expeditions had become engines of culture, not just a means of transport. Piracy followed trade routes like a dark shadow and forced states to build new navies. Where wealth travels predictably, predators instantly appear. As trade routes became clear, pirates learned to lie in ambush in straits, islands, and crowded port entrances where ships had to pass. Their success depended on speed, instilling fear, and perfectly knowing the geography and tides of that area. Commercial ship crews usually had no chance against them. A pirate attack could rob the cargo, hijack the ship, or hold people hostage for ransom in a matter of minutes. The reaction to this changed maritime history. Countries started financing stronger patrol ships, building armed escorts, and coordinating convoys. Insurance markets grew, and ports tightened rules on paperwork. Even ship design evolved towards lighter and agile ships that could quickly escape trouble. Piracy created its own legends, of course, but the reality was much more practical and terrifying. It was organized crime on the open seas, and it fed off the exact same global connections that made cities rich. The ocean turned into a massive chessboard where trade and violence read each other's moves. The Trieste became the first vehicle to reach the deepest point on Earth and return safely. In the early 1960s, the bathyscaphe Trieste took 2 men down toward the deepest known part of the ocean. The descent took hours, the light slowly faded until the world outside the window turned pitch black. The pressure rose to a level that would crush ordinary steel like paper. So, the crew trusted that thick pressure sphere and flawless engineering. The vehicle passed through layers with different temperatures and densities along the way. Each one was like a boundary between different worlds. When they reached the bottom, the sea floor wasn't some dramatic cliff. It was a pile of silent sediment that stirred into a cloud of dust with the slightest movement. The real success here wasn't just reaching that depth. The real deal was being able to return. Returning safely proved that people could visit that fatal zone, deadly depths, and survive. That single dive became the ultimate symbol of what exploration can do when curiosity meets flawless craftsmanship. It also started a challenge that still feels legendary even today. If humans can touch the deepest point, then the rest of the ocean's mysteries aren't out of reach, they just require a bit more effort. Ancient Egyptians set sail to the Red Sea for incense and rare woods. Just think about it, these journeys weren't exactly casual coastal strolls. The crew moved through scorching heat, hidden reefs, and sudden storms that could splinter a ship in seconds. Their goal was treasure you could smell and touch. Those sacred resins burned in temples, durable timbers that couldn't be found on the banks of the Nile, and rare materials that made royal ceremonies feel connected to very distant horizons. Just getting to the sea was as hard as sailing itself. Supplies had to be gathered, boats had to be prepared, and departure had to match the right wind seasons that would make a safe return possible. When an expedition successfully returned home, it proved that planning could stretch beyond the desert borders and all the way into the open waters. It also showed that exploration doesn't always start with fame and glory, but sometimes just with a desire. The longing for a sacred scent and sturdy wood was more than enough to pull ships into the unknown. Rome's grain fleets fed cities, and storms could shake entire empires. A massive city can be conquered without a single soldier if its food stops arriving. Rome's power relied heavily on massive grain shipments crossing the open seas, especially when local harvests couldn't meet the huge demand. Those ships were literally floating lifelines. When the seas were calm, the system ran like clockwork and looked unstoppable. But when the weather turned, everything became terrifyingly fragile. A delayed grain convoy meant starvation, public riots, and political crises spreading faster than any rumor. That's exactly why Rome invested so heavily in ports, massive warehouses, and naval protection. That's also why captains studied seasonal winds with an almost religious obsession. The sea was both the lifeline and the biggest threat. It could bring abundance and prosperity, but it could also wipe it all out overnight. Ocean expeditions in this era weren't always about drawing maps or exploring. They were about keeping daily life alive on an imperial scale. Every successful arrival was a quiet victory, and every sinking ship was a bitter reminder that nature was still the ultimate boss. Arab and Swahili sailors rode the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean. In the Indian Ocean, the wind itself is basically a train schedule. Monsoon winds change direction with the seasons, which means a journey is planned according to nature's rhythm. like a promise made to the sky. Sailors along the Arab coasts and the Swahili city-states in East Africa learned very well to set out when the winds would carry them outward, and return when the winds shifted to push them back home. This seasonal rhythm created an incredibly stable trade and travel network connecting East Africa, Arabia, India, and beyond. Ports turned into multilingual, massive meeting points where ivory, gold, spices, and fabric circulated together with stories and beliefs. Navigators built a body of knowledge that was practical, repeatable, and shared across generations. To them, the ocean wasn't a dark void to be feared. It was a timed corridor that rewarded patience and punished impatience. When you understand the winds, the distance between continents literally shrinks. The sea, which looks like a massive obstacle, turns into a bridge that opens, closes, and opens again when the time is right. Norse sunstones might have actually helped find direction on cloudy days. Just imagine, there's a pitch-black gray sky above, not a single star or sun to guide you, and you're just standing there on the deck. Some researchers say that certain special crystals could reveal the sun's position through polarized light even when clouds hit it. This idea isn't a 100% confirmed fact, and the remaining sources are a bit mixed with legends. Still, just the thought of it is fascinating because it shows how navigation can snatch clues from nature in surprising ways. If a sailor could find his way by looking at the right stone and examining it carefully, then those gloomy cloudy seas wouldn't feel like a locked room. This also fits perfectly into a broader truth about long journeys. Sailors will test absolutely anything that might reduce uncertainty. From the flight of birds to the shape of the waves, to the color of the horizon. Whether sunstones were widely used tools or just legendary tricks, this story points to human ingenuity under pressure. When you can't see the sky clearly, you learn to read the light itself. The astrolabe allowed sailors to read latitude by looking at the height of the stars. Taking a precise measurement on a moving, rocking deck like a cradle is a total nightmare. Yet, the astrolabe gave sailors a way to measure the angle of a familiar star or the sun above the horizon, and then translate that angle into latitude on a map. It didn't miraculously solve every problem, of course, and choppy seas could instantly turn a careful measurement into a garbage guess. Still, it rewrote the mental map of a journey. A ship could now know how far north or south it had drifted, making return routes safer and long ocean crossings much more confident. It also brought a new kind of discipline to exploration. Making observations became a routine chore, recorded, compared, and tirelessly repeated night after night. This rhythm turned the sky into a full partner in finding direction. When you can measure where you are on a north-south plane in the middle of the ocean, the sea ceases to be pure uncertainty. It turns into a coordinate system you can intentionally and knowingly enter. For sailors, this change was incredibly thrilling. Because it meant the sky could guide them even in waters that offered no landmarks at all. The cross-staff measured the heavens but ruined sailors' eyes. This tool was very simple in design but truly brutal in practice. A sailor would press the wooden staff to his face and slide a crosspiece until it aligned with the horizon and the sun, or a star, and then read the angle from the markings on it. When used with stars at night, it was relatively fine. But when used with the sun, it was a total disaster. Staring repeatedly into that blinding brightness to take measurements was ruining sailors' eyes, and they paid the price for that precision by suffering and risking going blind. Yet the crew kept using it, because knowledge at sea has a price, but the price of ignorance is much heavier. The cross-staff represents that harsh, sweaty reality behind those cool and elegant navigation stories. Tools weren't magical. They required steady hands, a clear sky, and bodies willing to suffer just to find the right spot on the map. That's exactly the true texture of exploration history. Those grand discoveries were built out of those uncomfortable, silent moments where someone stared into the burning sun with stinging eyes, because a single degree of error could mean missing the land by miles. John Harrison's chronometers turned timekeeping into a life-saving device. The solution to finding longitude, east-west position, was actually time itself. If you could know the exact time of the port you left while sailing far away, you could compare it with your local noon time and calculate exactly how far east or west you had traveled. This sounds very easy until you remember what ships go through. Rocking decks, the rotting salty moisture, sudden temperature changes, and that never-ending vibration instantly shatter delicate clock mechanisms. John Harrison spent years of his life to build those durable clocks, chronometers, that refused to drift even a second even if the ocean did its best to destroy them. These devices weren't just cleverly designed machines, they were portable safety shields. A captain with a reliable clock could plot a position that relied on facts, not hopes. This changed the outcomes in a way that maps alone could never achieve. Journeys became straight and precise. Finding land by chance ended, and those deadly reefs could finally be easily avoided. In the history of expeditions, there are very few things as dramatic and cool as a clock that doesn't lie to you even in the middle of a storm. Dead reckoning worked until currents secretly stole ships off course. Dead reckoning gives a person a lot of confidence because it only uses things you can see and feel: your speed in the water, your direction on the compass, and the time that has passed since you last knew your position. Put them all together, and you get a clean guess of where you should be. But man, the ocean's math is different. Currents slip silently under a boat like invisible rivers and drag the ship sideways terribly without ever changing the wind in the sails. A crew might hold the wheel tightly for days thinking they're on course, only to realize they were being pushed diagonally towards a disaster when they crash into the shore. That's exactly why a piece of land sometimes appeared suddenly with a shock, or never appeared for days. Dead reckoning also depended very much on the human factor. A tired sailor miscalculating the speed, a worn-out measuring rope, or a tiny steering error could pile up into a massive deviation. Explorers learned a very big lesson from this: you can navigate the sea, but you can't command it. When the water moves, it drags you and your map along with it. Ship logbooks became scientific records, one careful entry at a time. A ship's logbook initially started just as a tool to discipline the crew and for accountability. But quietly, it turned into a massive treasure for science. Every single day, the wind direction, cloud conditions, the roughness of the sea, and how far the ship advanced had to be recorded. As months passed, these daily notes formed a huge pattern. A single captain might notice seasonal changes, but thousands of logbooks accumulating over decades solved a much bigger secret: where storms broke out, where windless calms tracked ships, and how currents behaved in different seas. The logbook also captured the human and emotional side of exploration in the rawest way: broken masts, strange lights in the sky, birds never seen before, and the current mood of the crew. Years later, researchers learned to read these yellowed pages like a data bank, even though the sailors who wrote them never imagined such a thing. This is one of history's most silent miracles. That boring, ordinary daily routine created a massive record of the ocean's moods. The sea went from being a collection of exaggerated sailor stories to a place that could be compared, mapped, and scientifically studied. Sailors learned very well that ocean waves could point to land entirely out of sight. Land makes its presence known long before it appears, with signs that are very easy to miss if you don't know what to look for. Islands can shape the water around them even when the coast is nowhere on the horizon. Waves hit that island, reflect, break, and mix, creating a bizarre rhythm that experienced sailors can feel even through the wooden hull of the boat. That wild rhythm of the sea suddenly changes, and this change acts like a signpost guiding you from afar. As you get closer to land, you also come across floating tree branches, different seabirds, or that subtle shift in the color of the water. Yet, the wave is always your most loyal companion. They travel from far away and carry that information to you like a messenger. Writing down this kind of sensory knowledge is very hard, and it's very easy to dismiss for someone looking from the outside, which is why landlubbers usually misunderstood these sailors. But in the middle of the ocean, this knowledge truly saves lives. When you can just look at the moving water and feel the direction, the ocean stops being an impassable wall. It turns into a thin veil that can be read and, if you have the courage, safely passed through. Trade winds became the highways that provided exploration and colonization. In the tropics, the atmosphere creates wind belts that blow with such incredible consistency it would surprise you. Sailors realized that if you entered the right latitude, these trade winds could fly ships westward at a speed that felt almost effortless. Returning usually meant having to find a different wind belt, which created looping routes that dictated where ships traveled and which ports got rich. Once these wind patterns were figured out, the whole vibe of exploration changed. Journeys were no longer, let's see what happens, deadly gambles, but ticking, planned systems. This efficiency expanded the borders of countries, and that expansion fueled the desire to conquer other places. Colonization didn't just explode because kings wanted land, it happened because winds allowed ships to cross the ocean regularly and reliably, and those regular crossings made it easier to manage and exploit distant lands. So those trade winds weren't just weather. They were the hidden engine operating in the background of history. They carried explorers to brand new shores, but they also carried violence, slavery, and that exploitation on their shoulders. A steady breeze can carry humanity's greatest ambitions and its darkest sins all at once. The doldrums drove ships crazy with heat and hunger for weeks. Near the equator, there was a zone sailors didn't even want to hear the name of, the doldrums, where sails just hung loose, the wind forgot to blow, and the ship was literally nailed to the sea. A ship would just sit there under a scorching sun, while the ocean was calm enough to mock them. The water in the barrels heated up, grew moss, and tasted disgusting. Food rotted, nerves frayed, and as every damn day passed without the ship moving, maintaining discipline became impossible. The psychological pressure of this was unbelievable. You're looking at an endless ocean, you're completely free, but you're literally in a prison. Then suddenly, without any warning, a violent storm would break out, rain would pour down, and the sky could tear the sails apart as if it had changed its mind and gone into a fit of rage. Expeditions were usually planned to avoid this hellish zone, but currents or contrary winds dragged many ships right into it. The doldrums tell us something very important about ocean travel. Danger doesn't always mean giant waves or storms. Sometimes danger is just stillness. Sometimes the real enemy is time itself, that endless waiting until water and hope start to run out. For explorers, being able to endure that silence and desperation was just as vital as being able to steer the ship in a giant storm. Scurvy took more lives than cannons until citrus fruits changed maritime history. On those endlessly long journeys, sailors started dying in a very strange and terrifying way. Their gums swelled, turned black, and bled. Old wounds that healed years ago suddenly reopened for no reason. Their legs gave out, and pulling even the smallest rope turned into an unbearable torture. A ship could leave port with a crew like lions, and arrive months later like a ghost ship with men turned to skeletons. The most tragic part of it all was that scurvy wasn't the work of sea monsters or curses. It was simply a nutritional collapse caused by months of not eating fresh fruits and vegetables, what we know today as vitamin C deficiency. For centuries, sailors looked for a cure through prayers, superstitions, or weird mixtures that didn't work at all. Meanwhile, the ocean ruthlessly continued to collect the corpses. When the cure for this was finally found and spread, it didn't just change the health of sailors, it changed the balance of power in the whole world. A navy that could keep a ship full of men alive without getting sick could now sail much further, stay at sea for months, and return home safely. The ocean hadn't actually become any more merciful, people had just learned to prepare better. A simple lemon or orange juice, carefully stored in barrels and distributed drop by drop, took ocean journeys from being a slow death sentence and turned them into real, sustainable exploration. Captain Cook's diet obsessions showed that preventing these diseases actually depended on a strict routine. Some captains used to brush off the illnesses on board saying, "It's fate," but Cook looked at it as a problem that had a formula and could be solved. He established rules that looked very ordinary from the outside but were actually revolutionary for that time. His obsession with ship cleanliness, ventilating the lower decks, and the quality of the food stock, that slow rot that consumed the crew on long voyages. He insisted on durable provisions that wouldn't spoil easily, and he tested new foods, like sauerkraut, that would keep his men healthy inside the cramped wooden box for months. It wasn't just about feeding them one miraculous meal. It was the fact that even in the middle of the ocean, on a ship soaked in salt and moisture, health could only be managed through a strict discipline and policy. This approach changed all the expectations of the sailors. Now the men saw that survival didn't just depend on luck or blind courage, but on good planning, cleanliness, and a leader who cared about the details in the kitchen. This is one of the most crucial points in exploration history. Those massive discoveries weren't just won on windy decks, they were often won in the ship's dirty kitchen. When sailors stopped dying like flies from scurvy, the boundaries of the map suddenly expanded incredibly. The Manila galleons literally stitched Asia and America together right through the middle of the ocean with a single route. Just imagine, there is a single massive sailing route that crosses the largest ocean in the world year after year, carrying only silver in one direction, and silk, porcelain, and spices in the other. That's exactly what the Manila galleons were, a massive bridge connecting the Philippines and New Spain, Mexico, planting the first seeds of modern globalization. This journey was truly long and brutal. Ships had to calculate their departure time meticulously to avoid storms, ration water drop by drop, and survive typhoons that tore sails like paper. The crew was left alone with months of isolation that tested not just a man's skill but his sanity. But the reward at the end was so immense. A single successful journey could completely change the economy of countries, make kings rich, and fill cities with magical, exotic goods that people hadn't even heard the names of before. Ports became massive melting pots where languages, foods, and cultures clashed under the pressure of profit hounding and long distances. This wasn't just a regular trade network. It was that massive underwater bridge that proved the Pacific Ocean could be crossed not just by blind luck, but according to a clockwork schedule. The Atlantic slave trade, however, was not a discovery that crossed oceans, but a dark passage entirely full of bullying. This is no heroic sea-crossing story. It was a system of violence that turned ocean routes into an industry feeding entirely on human suffering. People were torn from their homes, chained onto ships, and forcibly transported across the Atlantic under horrific conditions designed solely for maximum profit, not for survival. This passage stole their names, their families, and their entire futures. It fed the plantations in America and the empires of Europe with their stolen labor. Those slave ships were floating prisons where diseases ran rampant and despair never ended. No matter how desperate the odds, resistance was always there, from refusing to eat, to damaging the ship, to even starting mutinies in the middle of the ocean. The scars of this horrific system didn't just end when the ship docked. It shaped economies, laws, and identities across multiple continents, leaving deep wounds that are still bleeding today. When we talk about ocean history, we have to look this truth in the eye without turning away. Because it shows us that the ocean, carrying heroic explorers, new ideas, and precious goods, was also carrying a savagery on an industrial scale, and remembering this is the most basic condition of justice. Privateers completely erased that thin line between war and trade in those tense seas. When you looked at a privateer captain, you couldn't tell him apart from a normal merchant until his wallet and his patriotism aligned. States gave these private ships a legal paper called a letter of marque, granting them the authority to attack enemy merchant ships, loot their cargo, and sell the booty, sharing the profit with the state. This literally turned war into a business model, a corporation. A fearless captain could get rich in a single voyage, and while doing so, he could economically weaken the enemy country without using a single warship. Of course, the line between legal confiscation and downright piracy was pretty blurry in the middle of the ocean. You could be hailed as a hero in one port, and find yourself on the gallows in another just because your papers were missing. For regular sea voyages, the impact of this was terrifying. Trade routes had literally turned into battlefields, and even completely neutral ships were harassed or sunk because they were mistaken for the enemy. Ports buzzed with the stories of these looters, and captains setting sail looked with suspicion at every sail on the horizon, not just their maps. Privateers changed all war strategies because they attacked exactly the jugular vein of an empire, merchant ships. This business created ruthless and brave sailors who learned to navigate not only the oceans but also laws, alliances, and the fine lines of what was considered legal in war. Mutinies broke out when the captain's leadership collapsed and ocean journeys turned into a complete nightmare. A ship is a tiny wooden world that you can't just easily walk off and leave. When food spoils and runs low, when sailors doubt they'll get their pay, or when the captain's discipline turns into torture, there is nowhere for that built-up anger to discharge. It builds up with every watch, with every order given. A mutiny usually starts silently with agreements whispered in dark corners, and then suddenly explodes at that breaking point where the crew overcomes the fear of punishment and refuses to obey the captain's orders. Some mutinies were just desperate moves to survive a ruthless captain. Others were bloody shows of force fed entirely by greed for power and ambition. Whatever the situation, a mutiny proves how fragile that invisible social contract keeping the ship moving actually is. The captain thinks he holds the authority on the ship, but the ocean holds them all in its palm. If the crew decides that the journey is no longer worth dying for, the captain's entire mission and authority sink to the bottom of the sea overnight. Of course, the aftermath usually didn't end well for the mutineers. Even if they were completely right in their complaints, they faced exile or execution when they stepped on land. Yet, mutinies forced those arrogant navies and trading companies to face the inhumane conditions on board. Ocean exploration isn't just about drawing maps, it's also about how far humans can go under heavy pressure. Shipwrecks created deep underwater museums that still hide their cargoes under the sand. A shipwreck is actually a massive time capsule tightly sealed by cold water, salt, and pitch darkness. When a ship sinks to the bottom, it drags the entire reality of the moment it sank down with it: tools, pottery, gold coins, massive cannons, personal letters people wrote to their loved ones, and a bunch of ordinary items that would never survive to this day if left on land. Over time, ocean currents slowly bury and uncover these items in the sand like reading a book page by page. Archaeologists can decode the trade networks of the period from a cargo scattered on the ocean floor, or even calculate the severity of the storm that sank the ship by looking at the splintered wooden hull. Underwater sometimes preserves history with astonishing perfection. In places with low oxygen, wooden ships don't rot, and tightly sealed barrels can preserve the wine inside for centuries. Yet, wrecks on treasure chests filled with gold like in the movies. They are mostly the graves of hundreds of people and demand great respect. Besides, whose property they are is always a massive crisis: who owns a treasure swallowed by the sea? Dives to wrecks are not just a scientific research, but also an ethical journey. With every dive, that heavy question echoes: are we learning something from the past, or are we just looting the place? A true investigation treats the sea floor like a museum without glass and a monument that must be respected. Salvage divers inadvertently leaped an era in diving technology while recovering sunken treasures. Rescuing a sinking cargo was always a race against time and the ocean. That cargo was very valuable, and storms or shifting sands could bury it on the sea floor forever. The divers of that era went down in pitch-dark waters with makeshift equipment, risking massive death, and worked just by feeling around with their hands. That terrifying water pressure crushed their lungs, the nitrogen building up in their blood clouded their minds, and the slightest equipment failure turned that salvage operation into a new disaster in seconds. To survive, the crew found solutions through trial and error. They improved the pumps pumping air from the surface, invented more durable hoses, sturdier helmets, and pressure valves. They learned very, very bitter lessons about the danger of getting the bends, decompression, while coming up from the water. Innovation followed danger like a shadow in those dark waters. These efforts, which started just to salvage a few gold coins or cannons, created the technologies years later that made underwater science, massive bridge constructions, and submarine rescue operations possible. These divers also fundamentally changed the way people viewed the underwater world. The sea floor was no longer just a place where fish lived, it became a work site where people could go down, work, and do research. Weird but true, greed and curiosity worked shoulder to shoulder at the bottom of the ocean. The ambition to recover sunken gold forced people to build the tools that opened the depths of the ocean to archaeology and engineering. The first submarine cables turned oceans into massive global messaging lines. Just think, before these cables, news could only cross the oceans at the speed of a windy ship. A war could have already ended on one side of the world, but the president on the other continent might not even know it had started. The submarine telegraph cables laid on the ocean floor shattered this relationship between time and space. Messages between continents were now transmitted in minutes, which instantly carried diplomacy, the stock market, and journalism to a whole other dimension. Stock markets could react instantly, governments could establish transoceanic coordination, and families could receive a short telegram in minutes that they used to wait months for. Of course, achieving this was an engineering hell. Those massive cables had to withstand the rotting salty water at the bottom of the ocean, unbelievable pressure, rubbing against rocks, and bottom currents. The insulation had to be perfect, and the cable had to be laid slowly without snapping under its own weight into that depth. Cables broke constantly, and every mistake taught engineers and sailors very bitter and expensive lessons about the ocean floor. When that cable finally connected to the opposite shore without breaking, it felt like magic becoming reality. The ocean didn't physically shrink, of course, but it shrank emotionally. That old feeling of lonely distance disappeared, and the sea went from being just a puddle where ships floated to a highway where information flowed at the speed of light. Cable-laying ships actually mapped the ocean floor long before sonar technology was even invented. You can't just drop kilometers of cable to the bottom of the ocean, you need to know what the ground underneath is like. If there's a steep cliff, sharp rocks, or a rough bottom down there, it'll cut that cable right away. Long before modern sonar devices took X-rays of the ocean, the crew of these ships mapped the ocean floor in their heads using depth measurements taken with weights, the tension of the cable, and its reactions as it unspooled from the reel. Every time the cable snagged, scraped against rocks, or suddenly dropped into a void and went slack, it actually gave them clues about the shape of that unseen ground. Throughout hundreds of projects over the years, these clues came together to form a massive draft of underwater geography. Those giant underwater valleys, plateaus, and completely unexpected massive underwater mountain ranges slowly began to appear in the notebooks of engineers and sailors. There was nothing flashy about this job, but it literally created a revolution. The bottom of the ocean ceased being a black void on the map. It turned into a real landform with hills, pits, and dangers. The main goal of these ships was just to connect two continents with telegraph, but as a side effect, they explored a whole world. Within that purely commercial industry, the ocean quietly spilled its own secrets. Those cable ships became accidental explorers writing the early chapters of ocean floor cartography with every meter of cable they laid into the sea. The whole storm forecasting thing started with sailors telling each other about their experiences in different oceans. Long before weather satellites or anything were around, sailors looked at the sky like a live, constantly read book. They read the approaching apocalypse by looking at the shaping of the clouds, that change in air pressure, the winds suddenly shifting direction, and that weird color the horizon took. A single experienced captain could sense the approaching danger, but to make a weather forecast covering the whole ocean, everyone's experience had to be combined. As years passed, captains began to compare the notes they collected from different routes and seas with each other. That's when that big picture emerged. Winds blowing from certain directions were always followed by a certain storm. The sea suddenly becoming dead calm wasn't a stroke of luck, it was the biggest warning of an approaching disaster. Even on a sunny day, if the barometer kept dropping, it meant trouble was on the way. Later, port authorities, navies, and the first meteorologists collected these logbooks from ships and mapped the paths of storms and seasonal wind charts. This event completely changed the plans of ocean expeditions. Now captains could choose safer months, avoid the paths of storms, and take those warning signs seriously as a vital reality rather than just old wives' tales. Predicting the weather didn't stop storms, of course, but at least it gave those wooden ships a fighting chance. This situation also shows one of the most beautiful aspects of exploration history. The ocean only teaches you something when it is constantly repeated. When people listen to each other and share what they've learned from the ocean, even that wild and unpredictable sea becomes a bit more understandable. The passion for finding the Northwest Passage turned into a story of sailors freezing to death at the poles for centuries. For generations, European kings and merchants chased after a very short shortcut that would make them incredible money. If they could find the sea route passing over the icy top of North America and reaching Asia, they would bypass those months-long, dangerous journeys and avoid the navies of rival empires. That's why ships were sent into those ice-choked waters with hopes much bigger than their preparations. But the Arctic responded to this ambition with darkness, ice pressure that crushed the ship to dust, and a freezing cold that turned even pulling a simply rope into torture. Sailors battled scurvy, frostbitten fingers, and starvation while waiting for the ice to break and open a path for them. Ships could be trapped in the ice for an entire winter, and that endless waiting could drive men mad as quickly as a storm breaking the ship's mast. Expeditions still continued because finding that route meant capturing all the world's trade. Most ships returned with just a pile of bitter experience, and many never returned at all. The Northwest Passage legend is the most bitter proof that exploration doesn't always end with heroism. Sometimes exploration is just a long, terrifying list of casualties paid with humans freezing to death. Franklin's lost expedition became the most famous example of how extreme overconfidence against nature ends in disaster. When Sir John Franklin set sail toward the poles with his two massive ships, he was very confident in British technology, preparation, and that modern arrogance. They thought two magnificent ships, the best trained sailors, and canned food to last for years would turn that deadly ice route into an ordinary exploration tour. Then the ice closed in, and all those perfect plans lost all meaning. An entire expedition vanished into thin air in that white hell that forgives no mistakes. The following years turned into a complete nightmare for the families and the British government asking what happened to them. Years later, those who went looking for them found horrific traces showing that as things got out of control, those men faced starvation, freezing cold, and the darkest, most desperate decisions, including cannibalism, taken to survive. What makes this story so chilling is how perfect and ordinary everything looked when they set off. Orders were given, decks were polished to a shine, and everyone believed they would do a great job until nature changed the roles. The disappearance of those two ships in the ice proved that even the best technology in the world and the highest rank cannot protect you from nature. In the poles, knowing your place isn't a virtue, it's the most basic tool you must use to survive. The tragic end of the Franklin expedition bitterly taught all the explorers who came after him to respect the ocean's limits and to have a plan B for the moments when everything goes wrong and those plans you trusted collapse. In that icy hell where European maps were total garbage, the knowledge of Inuit, Eskimo, indigenous people became the only guide to survival. In that far north, listening to the experience of the local people wasn't a nice-to-have option, it was the thin line between living and freezing to death. The Inuit read the sea ice not as a flat white blanket, but as a living terrain constantly moving, with safe passage routes, deadly pressure cracks, and seasonal rhythms. They knew very well how to find their way in blinding storms, how to hunt seals and fish where those European explorers saw only endless whiteness, and how to read that subtle change in the air hours before a massive blizzard hit. The tools they made and those fur clothes they wore fit that freezing environment perfectly because they had been tested for thousands of years. When the fancy expeditions of the Europeans got stuck in the ice, an Inuit's advice meant a safer route, a non-freezing shelter, and turning back from wrong decisions. But sadly, even though it saved their lives, those arrogant explorers always belittled or ignored this indigenous knowledge. This is one of the most crucial lessons of ocean exploration history. No matter how advanced the map in your hand is, if it's not based on the experience of someone who actually lives there, it's useless. Listening there is important. Respecting is important. Building a partnership is important. In a place where a single small mistake turns into a chain reaction disaster, sharing local knowledge about the ocean is the most precious treasure you carry on that ship. Antarctica expeditions proved how human endurance could leave even those flawless plans behind. Antarctica began to be explored in an era of steam engines, ships made of steel, and scientists thinking they had everything figured out. But that glacial continent demanded a kind of stubbornness and endurance that no engineering plan could put on paper. the crews stepped onto a continent of blinding whiteness, stormy winds, and isolation. There, the cold wasn't just a number on a thermometer, it was a crushing pressure you felt on your neck with every step you took and every decision you made. Brand new equipment froze and shattered, fuel ran out, and a sudden blizzard wiped out days of progress in an hour. Even the best equipped teams had to face the simplest problem, which was distance. Because on that glacier, every single kilometer had to be won by pulling the sleds against the wind with your own power. What kept the men on those expeditions alive wasn't a flawlessly working strategy. It was the ability to adapt instantly when things went wrong. They learned to repair what was broken, to ration the supplies they were terrified of losing drop by drop, and to keep walking even when that mass of ice offered them no ray of hope. Antarctic history is full of moments where survival depended solely on teamwork, psychological resilience, and those ruthless, tiny choices that had to be made in the moment. Exploring isn't always just about planting a flag somewhere. It's also about learning how to keep taking those stubborn steps when the world refuses your progress. Shackleton's crew survived that glacier, and this rescue story became a legend without a single casualty given. When Ernest Shackleton's ship, Endurance, got stuck in the Antarctic ice and was then slowly crushed to pieces, that massive scientific expedition suddenly turned into a struggle to keep 28 men alive. What happened after that moment was leadership in its purest form. Even though the horizon promised them nothing but freezing to death, Shackleton kept his men focused on daily routine tasks to prevent them from going mad, kept their morale high, and showed them only the small goals they could achieve. They camped for months on drifting ice floes, then when the ice began to melt, they set out into the stormy ocean in those flimsy little lifeboats, desperately looking for land and help. Their chances of survival under those conditions were close to zero. The freezing seawater clinging to them, starvation, exhaustion, and the risk of those small boats flipping over at any moment could have ended this story at any second. But Shackleton didn't give up. He took a few men and went to the nearest whaling station to find help, and then returned to save his other men whom he never left behind. The reason this story is so famous is that it rejects the cliché of great victory or great tragedy we are used to. The real victory there wasn't discovering a new coast or doing a scientific experiment. The real victory was bringing all those 28 men back home alive. This rescue operation is an incredible lesson on what a leader should do in a crisis and how belief is won by sharing, not by giving orders. In the history of ocean exploration, there are very few stories that show the human stubborn power to survive more clearly than this. Nansen's ship, Fram, intentionally got stuck in the ice and drifted to test a very crazy theory. Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen came up with an idea that sounded literally like suicide to the sailors of the time. Instead of trying to break the ice and move forward in the middle of the ocean, he would intentionally trap his ship in the ice and let the ice carry him. The specially built ship, Fram, had a round hull that would slide up over the ice when the ice tried to crush and shatter it, rather than breaking. The plan worked and the crew deliberately let themselves freeze into the thick ice sheet of the North Pole. As the ship drifted slowly towards the North Pole with those completely unknown currents, months turned into years. And it was proven that the ice was actually a massive, moving platform. This wasn't just sitting and waiting, of course. The men constantly took scientific measurements, used their supplies carefully, and stayed on alert at all times because they didn't know when the ice would start cracking. This experiment not only proved that bold theory about Arctic sea currents, but also tested human patience. Just imagine, you are constantly moving on the ice, but for days, months, under that gray, cold sky, you see absolutely nothing changing around you. Fram's legendary journey showed us a completely different style of exploration. Sometimes the best way to move forward is not to fight nature or force movement, but to cooperate with the environment's own natural movement. This was an exploration based entirely on engineering, trust, and a solid psyche. And it rewrote the plans for all the polar expeditions that came after it. Trying to cross the Southern Ocean for the first time brought even those huge galleons to their knees. The Southern Ocean, around Antarctica, has a terrifying reputation among sailors, earned through very bitter experiences. Winds start screaming without any warning. Waves turn into moving concrete walls in the ocean. And that freezing water punishes mistakes made with terrifying speed. The first sailing ships trying to enter these latitudes felt as if the ocean itself was alive and attacking them in anger. The waves beat the ship so hard that the wooden hull groaned, and the sail ropes literally screamed. Navigating there was also a complete nightmare because endless storms prevented them from seeing the sun and stars for days, and when fog rolled in, giant icebergs suddenly appearing could slice the ship like a razor. The crew was always soaking wet, about to freeze, and constantly repairing torn sails. Even trying to sleep in that cradle-like, non-stop rocking world was a torture. The very clear lesson those first dangerous crossings taught sailors was this: captaining skill is important, yes, but the power of nature sometimes crushes any skill. The Southern Ocean forced sailors to respect the latitude lines on the map not just as numbers, but directly as a death risk. It also proved that ship designs had to be much sturdier to survive. When a ship finally crossed those hellish waters and reached a calm sea, what the captain felt wasn't seafaring pride, it was just a deep sense of gratitude. Whaling journeys exacted a terrible ecological price on the oceans while drawing world maps. Whalers went after these giant creatures that constantly migrated in the oceans, so their ships reached the most remote corners of the ocean long before scientists even set sail. Captains carefully recorded the new routes they discovered, hidden currents, and deserted islands because their jobs depended on being able to find whales in the ocean over and over again. As years passed, these practical notes kept by whalers created a rough world map shaped entirely by the ambition to hunt and make money. But the price of the knowledge they gained was very heavy for the ocean. Whale populations were massacred. As the demand for lab oil and whalebone exploded, some species were literally brought to the brink of extinction. These hunting ships turned those small coastal towns into massive ports, built huge fortunes, and fed new industries. However, while those creatures that made them rich were being wiped out from the ocean one by one, looking back, we see that this history is nothing to be proud of, and it shouldn't be. Ocean expeditions usually mixed that pure curiosity of exploration with brutal exploitation, and whaling is the most ruthless example of this. It allowed humans to reach very distant seas, yes, but it also proved the hard way that the ocean's bounty is not endless. The modern idea of nature conservation actually emerged somewhat because of this, because people finally saw the bill of treating nature like an endless mine. From those hunters, we were left with ocean maps, but those missing whales were etched in memories as a silent map of how ruthlessly the seas were exploited. Naval wars developed ship design out of necessity, then scientists borrowed those designs. Fighting in the ocean is truly a brutal testing ground. When a ship's survival depends entirely on its speed, maneuverability, and withstanding cannonballs, navies poured money into better hull designs, stronger timbers, and more reliable steering systems. A naval battle reveals a ship's weaknesses instantly. A ship that is clumsy in heavy waves could be defeated by the waves before even firing its first cannon, and a design that saves a few seconds while maneuvering could win an entire war. When the war ended, these technological innovations weren't thrown away, of course. Explorers and scientists who set out later benefited greatly from those sturdy ships built for war, from equipment that withstood storms, and from supply depots. Because the features that saved lives while fighting also saved lives during months-long stormy scientific journeys. Those reinforced warships could now carry much heavier scientific measuring instruments, could sail without sinking even in the fiercest hurricanes, and could stay at sea for months without splitting in half. The pressure of military competition, in this indirect way, expanded the horizons of science and research. It's a complex situation, actually. Some of the best tools we use to explore the ocean were first built to kill people, and then redesigned to know the ocean. The history of ocean exploration always wanders on this weird, uneasy border where progress and danger walk shoulder to shoulder. The transition from sailboats to steamships rewrote what distance meant at sea. Sailing ships were completely dependent on the wind and the mood of the weather, which meant how long it took to cross an ocean was basically a negotiation you made with the sky. Steam power ended that negotiation. Thanks to steam engines, a ship could continue on its way even if the wind refused to blow, and travel routes turned from a guess into a schedule. This predictability completely changed everything from passenger ships to naval war plans, and even the routes of scientific research ships. Of course, it changed the ports too. Steamships needed massive amounts of coal, repairs, and giant port infrastructures. So, coal stations and repair centers at strategic points across the oceans became incredibly valuable. The romantic era of sailing was over, replaced by coal smoke, giant engine noise, hellishly hot boiler rooms, and motors that constantly needed oiling. Traveling on the ocean went from waiting for the wind to managing a floating industrial plant in the middle of the sea. For explorers, steam power meant going to routes they couldn't reach before. But it also brought brand new problems, because if you ran out of coal in the middle of the ocean, or if that steam boiler exploded, the ship could be stranded helplessly in the middle of the sea, just like sailboats trapped in windless zones. Yet the real revolution was psychological. The oceans were still the same size, but that feeling of helplessness against nature was disappearing. Distance was no longer a dark void you had to endure. It was a math line you could calculate how many tons of coal you needed for and plan ahead. Coaling stations became the keystones determining which empires would rule the oceans. Steam power had saved ships from being slaves to the wind, but this time it tied them to the coal bunker. A huge navy or a giant merchant fleet could only show its power as far as the next coal supply station. That's why islands or small ports in the most remote corners of the world became massive strategic prizes for kings. A small, boring port filled with coal suddenly became more critical than the richest cities in Europe, because only they could keep the ship's engines running and trade schedules intact. The great powers of the world raced against each other for these small dots on the map. They signed lease agreements, built massive depots, and didn't hesitate to invade those lands just so their ships wouldn't be left stranded. A ship docking at a port in the middle of the ocean and finding the coal depot empty wouldn't just be delayed off its route. The moment it ran out of coal, it turned into completely defenseless prey in the middle of the sea. The job of loading coal at those stations was a torture in itself. Coal dust covered everywhere, the heat took your breath away, and the rush to get the ship back on the road turned the port into an anthill. These coal stops shaped the routes on the world map like beads on a string, and usually whoever held the end of that string, their flag waved in those distant waters of the ocean. The opening of the Suez Canal rewrote ocean routes and changed the world's balance of power. When the Suez Canal opened, it literally opened a shortcut door between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and all the ocean trade of the world suddenly bent around that door. Ships that used to have to make a months-long, dangerous journey far around South Africa, Cape of Good Hope, to get to Asia could now pass through that short route cutting right through the middle of Egypt. This canal didn't just save time. It changed which ports would get rich, which navy would intervene faster in a war, and controlling which lands suddenly became a matter of life and death. It also became easier for captains to make plans because they didn't have to gamble with those seasonal hurricanes while rounding Africa anymore. But the canal also brought a major security vulnerability with it. That narrow waterway became a crisis point where blockades and wars, a sinking ship, or even a small political crisis instantly paralyzed global trade. For explorers and science ships, this meant reaching the Indian Ocean and the Pacific faster to do their jobs. But for empires, the meaning was different. Ocean strategy now had a narrow, choke point, and choke points always draw war, competition, and the greed of states. The Panama Canal shortened ocean journeys and threw war strategies in the trash overnight. Before the Panama Canal was opened, getting a ship from the Atlantic to the Pacific meant taking the ship and its crew on a months-long hellish tour around South America, Cape Horn, where waves shattered every plank and winds tortured everyone. The canal took that months-long torture and turned it into a controlled passage through engineering marble locks and lakes that took a few hours. From that moment on, the strategies of the world's naval forces completely shifted. Warships could move much faster between two oceans, and merchant fleets could design their routes much cheaper and faster. Ports on both coasts suddenly came alive and grew rich, while towns on the old southern route were completely forgotten. Even the shape of scientific ocean expeditions changed. A research ship could now examine both oceans without spending months just trying to round South America, and getting supplies was more guaranteed. But carting that canal, there was a drama in itself. While opening that massive canal, engineers had to battle malaria that wiped out workers, endless tropical rains, and massive landslides that constantly collapsed. When that canal opened, two massive oceans were now connected by a narrow corridor. The ocean world felt like it had shrunk, and the power map of those who ruled the world locked tightly around that narrow, man-made hinge. The Great Circle route showed how maps lie, but it made ships arrive faster. When you look at that flat, square world map on the wall, the straight line you draw between two ports looks like the shortest way, right? But since our planet isn't flat but round, a sphere, an arc curving towards the north is actually a much shorter distance than that straight line. Great Circle navigation put ships on this exact route, adapting to the curve of the planet. When you look at these routes on those standard world maps we know, they look crooked and like they're going in a completely irrelevant direction. For example, when going from New York to England, curving the route north would give a new sailor the feeling that they were intentionally steering away from the target. But math doesn't lie, man. Taking the actual shape of the sphere into account seriously shortens the distance, saves massive amounts of fuel, and reduces the days spent at sea. This event changed the logic of how captains found their way, because it forced them to trust mathematical calculations rather than their own eyes or the deceptive comfort of those flat maps. It was also difficult to implement because to stay on that arc along the route, you had to constantly correct the steering and the compass. Great Circle routes remind us that exploring isn't just about finding new lands. It's also about learning the true shape of this ball you live on, and letting mathematics, not the map, guide you. Ocean currents were measured with glass bottles with notes inside, and then with GPS devices. Long before satellites orbiting in space or modern digital sensors were around, oceanographers used a very primitive but clever method to figure out how the ocean moved. They asked the massive ocean this question: where is the water going? For this, they sealed messages showing their route in glass bottles or released numbered pieces of wood into the sea. Then they waited for someone walking on a beach on a distant shore to find that bottle and write them a letter. Every letter that came back was a single piece of data obtained only by chance and waiting for years. Over time, by looking at the directions these bottles went, they noticed that there were massive highways, loops, and river-like currents in the middle of the ocean that sped up ships or threw them off course. With the advancement of technology, those romantic bottles were replaced by battery-powered and sensor-equipped devices, drifters, dropped into the water. These devices mapped those massive currents, which could never be seen from a ship's deck, second by sending their locations to satellites and diving to the desired depth. The movie-like romance of dropping a bottle with a message into the sea was replaced by regular data tracking, of course. Yet the basic logic remained exactly the same: let the ocean drag something for you, then read the route that item took to solve the ocean's secret. When currents finally became measurable, this completely changed ship routes, weather forecasts, and search and rescue operations at sea. The first global tide tables were made thanks to men waiting stubbornly and patiently on the shore. Waters rise, they fall, what's the big deal, you might think, but when you're trying to enter a narrow port where the entrance is blocked by reefs when the water recedes, exposing rocks that will pierce the bottom of your ship, knowing the tide is a matter of life and death. Those early tide calculation tables were written through the stubborn observations of people standing on the shore in storms, in the freezing cold, in the sun, recording exactly how much the water rose and fell every single day, day after day. These endless records solved the tide cycles. This turned coastal navigation from a "let's hope we don't hit the rocks" type of gamble into something planable that ran like clockwork. Now a captain could plan his route to arrive at the port at the exact safe hour when the water was highest, save himself from running aground, and exit the port much faster by catching the receding current behind him. Tides were also very important for going ashore during ocean expeditions. A lifeboat that mistimed it could be left stranded in the mud when the water receded, or it could be smashed against the rocks when the water suddenly rose. Scientists and sailors, by combining these records from ports around the world, understood that tides weren't just a local water movement, they were a global gravitational game played together by the moon, the sun, and the shape of the coast. These simple tables of numbers were the silent victories of sailors' patience, turning that wild rising and falling of the ocean into a clear clock everyone could use. Deep sea trawls pulled creatures looking like monsters from legends up from the bottom of the ocean. When those early science ships threw their nets kilometers deep into the sea and pulled things from the dark waters, they actually thought the net would come up completely empty. Because sunlight never reached those places, and they thought no living species could survive in that freezing darkness under so much pressure. Then those massive nets broke the water and came up. They were literally overflowing with bizarre animals that completely destroyed the rules of nature as we knew it. Some were transparent, you could see their internal organs, some had huge mouths with needle-like teeth, and some produced their own light to hunt in the pitch dark, glowing like lanterns suspended in the water. The shock the scientific world experienced wasn't just about their appearances. The idea that the deep ocean was a barren, dead desert was instantly trashed. It was proven that life adapted to the freezing cold, the bone-crushing pressure, and a pitch darkness that never saw the light of day in ways people couldn't imagine. Every time the winch pulled the net up, there was a tension mixed with fear in everyone on the ship, because no one knew what kind of monster would come out of the net from that dark bottom. These creatures also brought brand new questions with them. How do these animals find food when there's no sunlight? How do they find mates and reproduce in that pitch darkness? These deep ocean nets prove to us that the ocean is not a massive void. There is a massive and hidden alien world full of surprises living by its own rules hundreds of meters below our ships. The bathysphere proved that people could go down to the bottom of the ocean without a submarine. Just imagine this. While the daylight on the surface slowly disappears and turns into a dot the size of a coin, you are descending into the pitch darkness, to the bottom of the sea, inside a tiny steel sphere connected to the ship by just a steel cable. The first bathysphere device was exactly this. A claustrophobic steel room for two people, with walls thick enough not to be crushed by that massive water pressure, tiny porthole windows, and no engine of its own. This wasn't some cool submarine going to heroic battles. It was a controlled drop made by gravity into that darkness, where if the steel crushed, you would die instantly. But what made this device revolutionary was that a human personally went to that depth for the first time. Scientists could look out of that small window and watch and describe the animals, which were previously crushed by nets and brought up dead, in their natural habitat, in real time. They reported those weird glowing lights gliding in the dark, massive creatures passing by slowly, and the feeling of being suspended in a completely alien environment on their own planet. The bathysphere proved that despite that incredible pressure, descending to the bottom was possible with solid engineering and a bit of, well, a lot of, nerves of steel. It also changed the definition of exploring. You no longer had to sail for months and go beyond the horizon to find a new, strange world. To find that alien world, you just had to go straight down, into the waters right under your boat. The first diving suits made it possible to withstand ocean pressure, but turned moving into an agony. A person wearing the heavy diving suits of that era turned into a robot walking in slow motion at the bottom of the sea. A heavy brass helmet on your head, lead boots to make you sink, and a long hose pumping air to you from the ship on the surface. These suits allowed people to walk on the bottom of the sea for much longer than they could by holding their breath. That water pressure that would instantly pop lungs became manageable, and impossible jobs like inspecting sunken ships, repairing port pillars, or recovering items from wrecks became doable. However, the price for this was moving as if you were paralyzed. Let alone swimming, divers progressed by dragging their feet in the mud at the bottom of the sea, and with every step they took, there was a risk of their hose getting caught on something. Communication with the ship above was done by tugging on a rope, and very simple problems like a kinked hose or a jammed air valve on the helmet could turn into a deadly nightmare in seconds. Visibility at the bottom was usually zero, so they worked blindly in the mud, feeling around with their hands, with incredible patience, and trusting their lives to those men pumping air on the ship. These bulky suits didn't make the ocean a friendly, swimmable place. They just pushed the limits and made it accessible. They also changed the way people imagined that sharp boundary between land and ocean. The sea floor, even though every movement was slow, excessively heavy, and very dangerous, turned into a work site where people could go down and work. The sonar device pulled the ocean out of blindness and turned it into a world measurable with sound echoes. In fog, pitch darkness, or at the bottom of the sea, the human eye's vision instantly drops to zero. Sonar gifted this blindness with a completely different sense based solely on sound. A sound wave, ping, is sent underwater from the ship. That sound hits an object and returns as an echo, and by measuring the time that passed, how far away the object is calculated. This brilliant idea completely changed ocean travel and exploration. Now, hidden reefs under the water could be noticed before the ship crashed, the depths of the ocean could be measured without dropping ropes, and sunken ships deep down where ropes could never reach could be found. Sonar also changed the way people visualized the seafloor. The bottom of the ocean was no longer a bottomless abstract well, it became a real geography with hills, mountains, giant cliffs, and valleys, whose map could be drawn by bouncing sound off it. For the crews of exploration ships, this meant massive confidence when entering waters they didn't know. If you can see with sound waves, you can plot your route much more clearly, and safely perform sea floor mapping tasks that once felt like suicide. Sonar didn't defeat that wild power or pressure of the ocean, of course. It just gave humans the ability to listen to the bottom of the ocean and turn those echoes into clear information. Depth charges in World War I took submarine warfare to a whole new level. When World War I broke out, the ocean stopped being just a surface battlefield where ships shot cannons at each other. Submarines turned invisibility under the water into a sneaky weapon, and navies desperately scrambled to figure out how to respond to this sneaky threat they couldn't see. The depth charge, water bomb, was the crude and primitive answer they came up with. Giant barrels filled with explosives, with a mechanism where you set the detonation depth, were dropped into the sea from the back of the ship. Every attack made was actually a deadly experiment based on sound, timing, and water pressure. The men on the ship listened for the submarine's propeller with sonar or microphones, looked for oil slicks leaking to the surface, and imagined which depth and direction the submarine was moving down there, adjusting the bomb's setting accordingly. When that barrel exploded down there, it didn't even need a direct hit on the submarine. That massive pressure shockwave under the water could crack the submarine's hull, blow out its valves, or force the crew to surface in a panic. This pressure of war accelerated technology so much that navies developed much better listening devices, new hunting tactics, and perfect coordination between ships. This war also changed oceanography, ocean science. Suddenly, temperature layers under the water and how sound waves bent and traveled in that water became the most critical information for soldiers' survival. The brutal and deadly urgency of war pushed ocean science rapidly forward, and unfortunately, it did this at the cost of sailors' lives. While convoys were trying to cross the Atlantic, math and statistics became the sailors' tool for survival. In World War II, while German U-boats, submarines, sneaked around hunting merchant ships, the Atlantic Ocean literally turned into a bloody numbers game with human lives at stake. If you were a ship sailing alone, it was only a matter of time before you were hit by a submarine torpedo and went to the bottom of the ocean without anyone seeing. That's why the convoy system was invented. They gathered dozens of merchant ships together, placed armed warships around them, and turned those defenseless targets into a massive walking fortress. The decision to form a convoy wasn't an emotional one made by saying, "Unity makes strength." It was based entirely on pure math. Commanders sat at desks and calculated sinking ship rates, weather reports, the speed of escort warships, and the probability of encountering German submarines. A tiny mathematical improvement made in the distance between ships or the timing of the route could save the lives of hundreds of sailors and millions of tons of food. Intercepted radio signals, storm forecasts, and patrol routes were constantly being recalculated. Even the ship's drawing zigzags, instead of going straight to make it harder for the submarine to aim, was a huge trade-off debated as, is fuel more important, or security? These convoys were like floating steel cities carrying tons of supplies and fear, crossing the ocean knowing the enemy was listening to them from under the dark waters. The statistics done in those gloomy rooms weren't just boring numbers for the sailors. A correctly done calculation was their hope of returning home. Convoys proved that surviving in the middle of the ocean depended not just on firing cannons, but on an iron discipline, cooperation between ships, and the courage to trust those cold mathematical analyses. The Titanic disaster bitterly rewrote all the safety roles of flashy ocean travel. When the Titanic sank into those icy waters, what sank to the bottom wasn't just a massive luxury ship. It was also the arrogant human belief that said, "We are greater than nature." They thought the massive size of the ship and that luxury would be enough to defeat the sea. The shock of that night threw those deadly gaps in the shipping company's safety culture right in their faces. Lifeboats that weren't put in just so the ship's deck wouldn't look crowded and ugly, wireless operators sleeping at night, and passengers never having done an emergency drill. While these were optional expenses that companies said, "It's fine if we don't have them," until that day, they suddenly turned into reasons for murder where thousands of people froze to death. After this disaster, governments and shipping companies gathered and rewrote maritime rules. Now it was made mandatory for someone to stand watch at the radio 24 hours a day, and it became a law to carry enough lifeboats to save everyone on the ship. Those icy routes in the North Atlantic were rearranged, and the International Ice Patrol was established to regularly report icebergs to ships. What makes this tragedy so permanent in humanity's memory is the collision of that flashy luxury with the ruthless reality of the ocean. That massive marvel of human engineering was defeated by a simple iceberg, cold water, pitch darkness, and ordinary human errors like the radio operator passing the message late. Ocean travel became much safer after that, because that disaster scared the world, and maritime rules were written in blood in memory of the people who froze to death that night. In expedition history, the Titanic is a very harsh reminder that the unsinkable lies in any shipping company's brochure don't mean a thing to the sea. The discovery of the Titanic revealed brand new living ecosystems on that rusty metal at the bottom of the ocean. Decades after the ship sank, being able to find its wreck required deep ocean sonar technology, very careful mapping, and patient searches done like looking for a needle in a haystack on a vast, pitch-dark seafloor. When the explorer's submarine finally illuminated the ship's hull with its camera, the shock they experienced wasn't just historical and emotional. What they saw was a biological miracle. That sunken graveyard was literally alive. Weird microbes and bacteria, Halomonas titanicae, never seen before, were eating the steel of that massive ship, creating huge formations hanging down from the ship that looked like rusty icicles, rusted glass. The ship had literally become a massive, artificial coral reef in the pitch-dark bottom of the ocean, a city where fish, crabs, and microbes created a brand new chemical habitat. This discovery dropped the jaw of the scientific world. Because the deep sea wasn't an empty, dead, and silent desert. Even in the dark, in the freezing cold, and under crushing pressure, there was a working, living ecosystem that colonized and broke down that massive man-made metal. This expedition also completely changed deep ocean exploration. Better quality cameras, better underwater robots, and sensitive instruments were invented just to be able to watch and measure that wreck without damaging it. The Titanic became a bridge between that bitter tragedy of human history and ocean science. It showed us how a massive human disaster could turn into a unique laboratory showing how nature pushes its limits at the bottom of the ocean. Jacques Cousteau brought the underwater world into people's homes and turned it into a massive public passion. Before Captain Cousteau, the underwater world was a very distant and secret place belonging to professionals wearing those thick diving suits, Navy soldiers, or scientists. Cousteau broke this taboo by proving that the ocean wasn't just a scary darkness where sailors or monsters lived, but a world that ordinary people on the street could watch in awe. Thanks to those legendary documentaries he shot with the underwater cameras he invented, people began to watch the sea floor, colorful corals, and fish dancing around while sitting on their couches in front of their TVs. The ocean was no longer a story told by someone standing on the deck, but a real world they watched directly from inside the water. This visual change changed everything. When people see something with their own eyes, they start to love and protect it more. This flood of love created by Captain Cousteau provided massive budgets for ocean research, inspired young people to become oceanographers, and started the first big environmental awareness to protect the marine environment from pollution. He also made that exploration ship phenomenon popular by using his own research ship Calypso like a moving studio and research base. The ocean was no longer just a place where countries fired cannons at each other or traded. It was a massive stage for curiosity, science, and awe. There are mistakes in Cousteau's own long career, of course, but the massive impact he left is indisputable. Underwater discoveries went from being rumors told by sailors in bars to a visual feast shared by the whole world in their living rooms. The world hidden under that bright reflection of the surface entered our homes, and never completely left again. The aqualung, scuba, turned those dark depths reserved for professionals into a park where ordinary people could swim freely. For many years, diving underwater meant wearing those massive, bulky brass helmets, walking clumsily on the bottom with lead shoes, and begging for air from a long hose connected to the ship above. The aqualung, invented by Cousteau and his engineer friend Emile Gagnan, shattered this situation by putting the air directly on the diver's back with a pressurized tank, leaving people free to swim wherever they wanted. Suddenly, exploring became an incredibly agile and practical thing. Divers could follow a coral wall, do somersaults around a sunken ship, or glide like a fish without those heavy shoes to watch the movements of schools of fish. This incredible freedom created new industries like underwater tourism and brand new entertainment areas. Of course, with freedom came a very big responsibility, because depth and the time spent at the bottom are no joke. The fear of getting the bends, decompression sickness, created a solid diving culture such as dive training, going into the water with a partner, buddy, and planning the dive minute by minute. The transformation was incredible, man. Underwater archaeology leveled up because they could carefully extract artifacts with their hands. Marine biologists started watching animals in their own homes, not in an aquarium. Underwater photography became common, and this made the public love the sea. The aqualung didn't conquer the ocean, but it invited millions of people to personally visit the ocean and return home with those wonderful stories they would tell when they surfaced. The first underwater habitats tested whether people could stay at the bottom of the water for weeks. Going down to the bottom of the water and diving is one thing. Living there is completely different. These underwater habitats were looking for the answer to a very crazy and bold question: could people live at the bottom of the ocean for long periods of time without ever coming to the surface, and also work efficiently? Scientists entered these sealed, steel boxes. While that massive mass of water outside pressed against the windows and the surface was far, far away, they slept, ate, and conducted experiments inside. That thing called saturation diving made this possible. Once the diver's body was saturated with that high pressure, they could go out of that steel house and work outside for days without suffering that hours-long decompression, bends prevention, torture experienced every day when going in and out of the water. Of course, at the end of that weeks-long mission, to come to the surface, they had to wait in a pressure reduction chamber in a single, but very long session. These underwater houses became the most bizarre laboratories testing human physiology, engineering, and human psychology. How does that isolation drive a person crazy when you only see sunlight filtered through the water but can't breathe fresh air for weeks? How does being locked in that box, where every exit requires a deadly dive plan, change the way people behave toward each other? These crazy projects developed the tools, communication systems, and life support devices that would later be used in industry and deep ocean exploration. The results that came out weren't just technical, they were very human. Mankind proved that the desire to explore could turn into a lifestyle where the ceiling wasn't concrete but a massive ocean, literally creating new routines and anxieties for oneself like living on a space station. Cold War submarines gathered highly classified data about the ocean, even if unintentionally, while quietly spying. During the Cold War years between the US and the Soviets, submarines were built entirely to hide from the enemy, for nuclear deterrence, and to sneakily listen to others. However, while doing these missions, they unintentionally created a massive treasure trove of information about the geography of the ocean itself. For a submarine to advance safely without hitting a mountain and to hide from enemy sonars, it needed to know the shape of the sea floor, the temperature layers of the water, and how sound waves bent and traveled in that dark water millimeter by millimeter. This military need forced a very systematic and crazy sea floor mapping in those empty ocean regions where civilian merchant ships never visited. These collected data were of course top secret military secrets, meaning the civilian scientific world wasn't even aware of them for years. But over time, these military experiences allowed underwater geography and underwater acoustics, the movement of sound, to be understood much better practically. Furthermore, these spy submarines could easily pass under the polar glaciers that civilian surface ships could never enter because of the ice, and under the most stormy seas. The ocean had become a chessboard where politicians ordered to be sensitive, and this sensitivity forced them to observe the ocean very well. It's a very weird chapter in expedition history. The men who boarded the submarine had zero scientific curiosity, their only goal was to hide from the enemy. Yet exploration happened anyway. Cold War paranoia sent these steel whales to the most remote corners of the ocean, and these warships, while trying not to be seen at all, massively expanded humanity's secret knowledge about the ocean. Nuclear-powered submarines made it possible to stay underwater longer than even some wars lasted. The old diesel-engine submarines had a huge weakness. Because diesel engines needed air, the submarine had to frequently come to the surface or stick its snorkel, air pipe, out of the water. This caused them to show up on radars, be vulnerable to the enemy, and made the time they could spend underwater very short. However, the invention of nuclear engines changed the game from top to bottom. Nuclear engines didn't need air. Thanks to this, a submarine could theoretically stay at the bottom of the ocean without ever coming to the surface until the supplies inside ran out or the crew psychologically went crazy. This situation completely changed the concept of existing in the ocean. A nuclear submarine could cross all the ocean basins in the world without showing its face even once, stay on patrol under the polar glaciers for months, and do duty at sea for a time much longer than older sailors could even dream of. The importance of this event for expedition history is as psychological as it is technical. The ocean was no longer a place people just went and visited from the surface with ships, it became a continuous environment where people lived non-stop. Finding your way at the bottom of the ocean, keeping that artificial air inside the submarine clean, and those military routines that would allow the men to live in that cramped closed box for months without losing their minds were perfected down to the smallest detail. Of course, this power, because the enemy could never know where your nuclear submarine was, also took global war strategy and fear politics to a whole other dimension. Still, this technology indirectly expanded our relationship with the deep ocean a lot. The necessity of staying underwater for months allowed currents, how sound spreads in the sea, and mountains on the sea floor to be mapped much better, and literally carried human engineering to a brand new era. The first global seabed map revealed that massive ridge passing right through the middle of the ocean. For centuries, mapmakers drew the deep ocean as flat, blue empty paper because no one could see what was down there. But over time, as measurements made with ropes dropped from boats and later scans done with sonar devices accumulated, a staggering pattern began to emerge on the map, a long underwater mountain chain passing through all the oceans in the world, connecting the basins like a stitch. This was the mid-ocean ridge system, a massive feature that most scientists never even imagined could exist. Seeing this giant mountain chain on the world map for the first time completely changed the story of our planet. The seafloor wasn't that dead, boring, static, and flat bowl they thought it was. It was a giant landform with its own structure, continuity, and holding huge clues about what was going on in the center of the Earth underneath it. These mapping efforts also revealed the deepest abysses of the world, trenches, massive fracture zones, and endless bottom plains, turning the ocean from a dark mystery into a recognizable landscape with valleys and peaks, just like the land. Putting together such a global map required incredible patience and international cooperation. It was the piecing together of scattered data coming from thousands of different ships and dozens of different devices over the years like a puzzle. It also required scientists to trust these indirect measurements, because no one had seen these giant mountain ranges with their own eyes, there was only a number sequence formed by echoes returning from sonar. This shift in approach is very important. The breaking points of expedition history always rely on our methods of perceiving new things changing. When that underwater ridge system appeared on the map, the ocean ceased to be the empty place where the world ends and became the biggest part of our planet's geological engine. The theory of plate tectonics was finally proven when that weird magnetic structure of the rocks on the ocean floor was read. Science ships sailing in the ocean started towing very sensitive devices, magnetometers, behind them into the sea that could detect even the slight changes in the Earth's magnetic field. What they found when passing over the mid-ocean ridges, underwater mountains, was so orderly that scientists were speechless. On the rocks on the sea floor, there were strong and weak magnetic strips running side by side, just like the stripes of a zebra. The craziest part of the job was that these lines were copied exactly like a mirror reflection, with perfect symmetry, towards both directions from the center of that underwater mountain. The reason for this was legendary. When that red-hot lava erupting from the center of the Earth cooled and turned into basalt rocks on the sea floor, they locked the magnetic direction of the Earth's north and south pole at that moment into themselves. Since the Earth's magnetic field also reverses occasionally over millions of years, these rocks literally created a giant barcode, a timeline carved into the bottom of the ocean. These symmetrical lines were shouting a very clear truth: new magma, sea floor, is constantly being produced from this rift in the middle of the ocean, and this new sea floor is pushing the continents outwards to both sides. This event wasn't some idea made up by a professor sitting at his desk at a university. It was rock-hard evidence collected by research ships passing over the exact same point in the ocean over and over again, stubbornly checking the accuracy of those magnetic patterns. When the secret of these zebra stripes was solved, the theory of continental drift stopped being a mocking debate that had gone on for years, and turned into a definitive map explaining how the Earth's outer crust constantly renews itself. The discovery of hydrothermal vents literally trashed scientists' rules about where life could exist. For a very long time, it was an indisputable, simple physical rule for everyone that all life on Earth ultimately depended on sunlight. Plants take the sun, animals eat the plant, the big fish eats the small fish. But when deep ocean research submarines found hydrothermal vents, those underwater hot springs where boiling water erupts from under the ground, on that pitch-dark floor of the ocean, they shattered this entire belief. Around these hot vents, far away from the sunlight on the surface, they saw incredibly dense communities of living things thriving entirely in the dark. Here, life was getting its energy not from photosynthesis, from the sun, but bone-chillingly from chemosynthesis, that is, from chemical reactions. Those weird microbes at the bottom of the food chain produced energy by eating compounds like sulfur in the toxic and hot fluids erupting from the vent, feeding the giant worms, blind crabs, and fish there. This discovery literally shook the scientific world because it rewrote two huge stories from scratch at the same time. First, it proved that the bottom of the ocean wasn't dead and empty, but hosted oases full of such bizarre creatures. Second, it showed that sunlight wasn't absolutely necessary for life to exist, that the planet's own internal heat and chemistry were enough. These vents also became a great hope for space researchers. If life can exist without sunlight, then why shouldn't there be life around hot vents in the dark oceans of Jupiter's or Saturn's ice-covered moons too? A dive made to the dark bottom of the ocean suddenly turned into the excitement of exploring planets in the entire universe. A submarine diving just to examine some rocks and dirt, with a single discovery, both rewrote biology and pushed the limits of mankind's imagination. Black smokers were mineral chimneys growing at incredible speeds at the bottom of the ocean, like a video on fast forward. Some hydrothermal vents don't just flow like a clean spring water. They erupt as black smokers, shooting superheated water loaded with minerals, iron, zinc, sulfur, from the ocean floor, literally like black smoke. The moment this boiling water hits the freezing water of the ocean near 0 degrees, the minerals inside instantly solidify and precipitate like a pitch-black cloud of smoke. As those particles fall, they build towering chimneys, in surprisingly short time frames within human attention, not over ages. Sometimes these chimneys grow so fast that they can even collapse and fall over because they get too long. Witnessing this is literally like watching the formation of a mountain that takes millions of years and fast forward in seconds. The chemistry there is so violent. The metals and sulfur in that boiling liquid combine, precipitate layer by layer, and form very valuable and rich mineral deposits on the bottom of the ocean. The research teams who first found these black smokers at the bottom of the ocean immediately understood what was in front of them, a fully fledged, natural, active factory that takes the hellish heat inside the planet Earth and turns it into brand new rocks and minerals right in front of their eyes in real time. These areas also create incredible, sharp temperature contrasts. The water just 1 meter away from the water coming out of the chimney is freezing cold, near the freezing point, while the water coming right out of the mouth of the chimney is boiling enough to instantly melt a diver's glove, sometimes 400 degrees. This is exactly why the deep ocean, while making you feel like you are completely on the set of a sci-fi movie, is also the most ruthless and real form of the planet. Those mud cylinders extracted by ocean drilling ships were actually the world's climate diary. When drilling ships with giant drills lower pipes to the ocean floor and extract long, cylindrical mud samples from the bottom, they are actually extracting time stacked in layers, not just mud from the sea. As years, centuries, millennia pass, the shells of tiny dead sea creatures, desert dust carried by the wind, and ashes of erupting volcanoes silently sink to the bottom of the ocean and compress layer by layer, leaving behind a massive archive that can stretch back millions of years. Scientists put these mud pipes on the table and read them literally like a diary written in slow motion. If the type of those tiny fossils inside changed, it means the ocean water warmed up or cooled down in that period. If the size of the sand grains changed, it means the direction of the winds or ocean currents changed in ancient times. A distinct line of ash in the layer is dated to a known volcanic disaster and puts a bookmark on the timeline. What makes this mud so valuable is that the ocean is a global trash can that collects the wind and ashes coming from all continents from wide areas, not just from one coast or plain. Even a single mud sample taken miles away from land can record the changes in the ice ages, rains, and giant currents of the world. In terms of expedition history, driving through the sea turned into making a deep listening towards the past by literally digging the seafloor. That mud isn't just a pile of dirt, it becomes a witness to the world itself, and climate changes turn into a history book you can hold and touch in the laboratory. The discovery of the deep scattering layer shocked navies and marine biologists in World War II. Old generation sonar operators noticed something bizarre and very strange while listening to the sound waves they sent from their ships. Instead of hitting the sea floor and returning, the sound waves were bouncing back from a thick layer in the middle of the water, miles wide, as if the sea floor had risen there. The weird part was, the depth of this fake sea floor was constantly going up and down from hour to hour. This situation, which initially felt like a ghost sea floor, floating in the middle of the ocean, terrified and confused the soldiers who relied on sonar to detect enemy submarines or measure depth. But the truth of the matter was far more fascinating than ghost legends. That layer the sound bounced off of wasn't rocks, it was made up of billions of living sea creatures reflecting sonar waves, most of them very small, krill, small fish, etc. What was even more mind-boggling was the daily movement these animals made. When daylight slowly faded and the ocean plunged into darkness, these trillions of creatures rose towards the surface like a giant elevator to feed. When the sun rose again, they sank back into those dark, deep waters to hide from predator fish. This giant rhythm of rising and falling was one of the largest mass animal migrations on Earth, and it was happening out of sight every day in the oceans without us even noticing. This accidental discovery linked the military technology used in wars to the science of biology in an unexpected way. It also reminded the explorers roaming the ocean isn't just salt water and rock. It has a giant, living, moving architecture made of sound, and until you figure out its rhythm, it can play with your mind even with your most trusted technological devices. CTD, conductivity, temperature, depth, devices poured the temperature and salinity in the water into a clear profile for the first time. A CTD package is like a giant chandelier with sensors on it. As it is lowered into the water with a crane, It constantly measures and records the conductivity, how salty it is, temperature, and pressure of the water with every meter it descends. The result that comes back to the ship isn't just a single number like, it's this many degrees here. It's literally a vertical X-ray of the ocean. In the profile projected on the computer, the layers emerge like a cake. Surface waters are warm and mixed with currents. A little below is much colder and stable. At some points, you see those sharp boundaries where the density of the water suddenly cuts off and changes like a knife. These invisible boundaries are very, very important because they completely shape how the food fish eat drifts in the water, how the sound waves sent by warships bend and advance in this water, and how those giant water masses in the world, like the Gulf Stream, circulate between the oceans. Before this invention, sailors would stick their hands in the water and only feel the surface temperature, making rough guesses about what the thousands of meters of darkness below were like. The CTD device turned this guessing into a very precise scientific structure. Oceanographers could now dip this device in the water at different points while traveling with a research ship and compare the results. They could watch on the screen how the ocean changed rapidly, not just horizontally as the ship moved, but also vertically as they went down meter by meter. It also made future ocean science much more reliable, because wherever you were in the world, measurements could be made with the exact same consistent method with the same device. Every time you dangled the device into the ocean at the end of the crane, it felt like asking a question into that freezing darkness and seeing the answer of that question clearly layer by layer on your screen as you reeled the cable back in. That ocean buoy network called ARDO turned the huge ocean into a massive, living system constantly sending data. In the past, we could only measure the ocean by chance on the routes where ships passed. Thanks to the ARDO project, those smart buoys, robots, released freely into the ocean and drifting aimlessly in the water for years started measuring the ocean at every moment. Each of these thousands of robotic devices maintains the same simple but exhausting cycle for years. First, it sinks to a certain depth in the sea and drifts freely with the currents for days. Then, as it slowly climbs back to the surface, it records the temperature and salinity of the water it passes through, like a CTD. As soon as it reaches the surface, it instantly sends these data to satellites and then dives back into the dark waters for the next mission. The result of this is a global ocean pulse constantly gathered from those desolate regions and harsh seasons that the world's giant ocean research ships rarely visit due to weather conditions or budget. This situation completely changes the way we understand the ocean's role in the world's climate crisis, because oceans trap that massive heat in the atmosphere and circulate it around the planet with currents. The ARGA network makes this massive heat trapped by the ocean measurable, not like taking a one-time photograph, but like a live broadcasting continuously. It also completely changed the human feeling of exploring. The ocean is still vast, but it's no longer silent during the times between those rare voyages of giant research ships. Those robots continue to watch the ocean non-stop. They carry man's endless curiosity even beyond the horizons their own eyes cannot see, and they do this patiently thousands of times without getting tired or bored. Altimeter devices on satellites solved sea level changes from space by measuring millimeter-sized swells on the ocean's surface. Those advanced satellites orbiting the Earth can measure the level of the ocean's surface with truly incredible precision by sending radars to Earth from space. And those tiny, invisible height differences on the surface of the sea actually tell us massive stories. The sea level doesn't just rise flatly because the glaciers at the poles melted or the ocean waters warmed up. Strong currents and stormy winds pile the water up like a hill in some regions, and pull the water down to form pits in others. The satellite altimeter takes these invisible undulations on the water and turns them into colorful maps showing where giant whirlpools and boundary currents are. This event is truly fascinating, because we can see the movement of even a single wave in the ocean from space without personally looking at the ocean. Furthermore, satellites help us understand not just the top surface of the sea, but the bottom as well. If the water level in a region is higher than normal, it is a harbinger of a warm water mass that has heated and expanded below. If the surface has sunk, it means there are dense and very cold water masses shrunk in that region. If you look at it for expedition history, satellites represent a new space age where we are not condemned only to sailboats, nets, or ships to explore the ocean. The ocean has become measurable from space everywhere, including waters where sending ships is too dangerous, desolate, or entry is forbidden due to political wars. This is a brand new kind of ocean journey where the device orbits the planet at the speed of light and reads the huge sea in fine detail. Those remote islands in the middle of the ocean became the needed property of countries just because sailors planted a flag on the beach, and bloody wars were fought over them for centuries. In many years in the past, being the first person in the world to reach an island meant officially owning that place. The ship's crew would go out to that beach in boats, hoist that famous kingdom flag waving in the wind, read an official, "I claim this place in the name of my king," declaration aloud, and proudly record these actions in the ship's old, worn-out logbook, as if the ocean had presented this empty land waiting to be claimed to them as a gift on a golden platter. Of course, the reality wasn't that simple and innocent. Some of those discovered islands already had natives living there for thousands of years, and these so-called flag-planting claims completely ignored those existing lives. Even other completely deserted and godforsaken islands were incredibly valuable because these islands became life-saving freshwater sources in the middle of the ocean, safe beaches for ships to take shelter from storms, or years later, a military base where coal depots for steamships and international communication cables were connected. As years passed, those tiny pieces of land that seemed worthless turned into massive points of contention that pitted countries against each other on maps, turned into crises and peace treaties, and made armies fight. Even a tiny rock covered in bird poop in the middle of the ocean could suddenly become priceless as technology developed. An island that used to only serve for a passing sailboat to find its direction, years later could become a matter of life and death for airplane routes, submarine fiber cables, or massive economic zones, like the continental shelf, that allowed countries to seize millions of square meters of ocean resources. This is exactly why ocean expeditions are inherently tied not only to that innocence of exploration, but also to very dirty politics. The moment you arrive at an island and take that first step, can sometimes be the echo of exploitation and wars that will last for generations, and a very simple, torn piece of cloth, flag, stuck in the beach can ignite the fuse of that never-ending debate ending in blood that starts the questions, who does this place belong to and who are we? The race to accurately measure the Earth's shape, geodesy, depended on those long, agonizing sea voyages. To prove that the shape of the Earth we know wasn't perfectly round but flattened at the poles, geoid, scientists needed to make massive measurements in different climates and latitudes on different continents, kilometers apart from each other. This job wasn't calculations to be done with pen and paper in a laboratory. Making a physically exhausting journey to those muddy lands was absolutely necessary. Sensitive and heavy instruments had to be transported carefully on ships without breaking. Observations had to be stubbornly repeated over and over again to be sure, and ultimately, the results had to be brought home intact so they could be compared with the data of other teams. Ocean ship voyages made this possible by connecting those distant points, where going overland by carriage was impossible, with a safe and practical route. Even if land travel was extremely dangerous or impossible due to gangs or geography, ships safely carried mapmaker tunes, massive clocks, giant mirror telescopes, and scientific notebooks to distant shores where the night sky could be observed cleanly and those basic distances between 2 points could be measured clearly. The scientist's goal wasn't just to satisfy a scientific curiosity. Knowing the true size and that flattened shape of the Earth more clearly meant perfecting the maps drawn for ships sailing at sea, finding the wind direction, and increasing the accuracy of the ship's real positions in the middle of the ocean. This is a wonderful and beautiful cycle. Discovery expeditions used navigation to carry the instruments and people who could measure the world, and the flawless results measured by those scientists made that same navigation much safer for other expeditions setting out later. The boundless sea helped transform that massive planet from an abstract idea debated by philosophers into a clear object, calculated, put into numbers, by people's stubborn patience, courageous traveling, and tirelessly repeated massive measurements. Coral reef expeditions showed us how slowly and patiently reefs grow, but how quickly they can die from a tiny environmental disaster. Those riot of color coral reefs at the bottom of the sea can look as hard and permanent as stone or rock from the outside. However, scientific ocean expeditions brought a completely different, fragile truth to light regarding this. Most of that massive structure of a coral reef is built millimeter by countless tiny coral animals, polyps, that lay down tiny calcium carbonate, limestone, skeletons non-stop, generation after generation, for years and seasons. The formation of that complex limestone architecture, which rivals developed cities, protects our shores from ocean waves, and provides a warm home for thousands of fish, takes centuries. But the bitter part of the matter is this: a sudden warming of a few degrees in the sea water, heat wave, a massive pollution spill mixing into the sea from the city on the coast, or a violent storm that tosses the bottom of the sea like a cotton gin, can deal fatal damage to that centuries-long effort in a single season. Researchers who come to check the same coral reef every diving season over the years see this contrast of extinction in the most painful and clear way. While a coral reef is a thriving, breathing, massive underwater city full of colors and chirping fish one year, the next year, it can turn into a pale, fragile graveyard like a skeleton, bleached dead, desperately fighting to come back to life. This discovery shook people's thoughts about the concept of time unique to nature. The ocean can build very slowly and patiently, but it can also destroy and take it back very quickly. Reef expeditions also taught humanity a much broader, heavier lesson about ocean stewardship, nature conservation. If the natural formation of a thing takes such a long time, lasting for centuries, then losing it due to human error is not just a passing piece of bad luck. It is the sinking and disappearing forever of a massive history that a human's lifespan will not be enough to see, which will never be able to return to its former state on its own again. Mapping the Great Barrier Reef required years of maddeningly patient measurements. That famous Great Barrier Reef in Australia is not just a single straight line drawn with a ruler as you see it on the world map. It is a deadly labyrinth of widespread reefs, sand shoals, deep channels, and sudden rocky outcrops thousands of kilometers long that can instantly punish and sink any ship that trusts a wrong sea chart or its own arrogance. Measuring such a massive and complex structure demanded making boring passes from the same routes again and again with the ship, dropping a rope from the boat again and again until your hands froze to measure the depth, and having the virtue of accepting the places where previous teams, or you, measured wrong with humility and going back to correct them. The map-making crew had to constantly measure the depth of the ocean tirelessly while predicting the shoals by looking at the color of the water every day, watching the wave breaks showing danger for hours, and while the wind threw the ship left and right and the tide waters changed the level every hour trying to turn the measurements into soup. This stubborn patience shown by those sailors wasn't just an academic quiz. Those accurate and flawless maps drawn meant safer navigation that saved lives for everyone from coastal trading ships to luxury cruise ships and research submarines that would enter those waters after them. The years of work done also revealed how alive and complex the reef systems actually were. Corals don't stand static, they grow, change direction, erode with storms, and distribute those hidden and deadly dangers to vast waters that look very calm from afar. Mapping such a moving place is like trying to draw a living labyrinth constantly changing its shape. That map's success off the coast of Australia wasn't just a dramatic moment of discovery by a single man. It was a determination layered by countless people over years. It is the art of transforming that deadly risk into useful information step by step with a more careful measurement taken each time. The Galapagos Islands became a unique biology lab that could only be reached by enduring that ruthless and harsh sea journey. Reaching the Galapagos in those old days meant setting your mind to spending long and depressing days in the open water with uncertain winds and water and supplies at the limit of depletion on the ship. This massive ocean isolation is exactly the real magic that made those islands so scientifically powerful in evolutionary terms. These island groups, close to each other but equally isolated, functioned exactly like a natural experiment set up by God. When similar creatures on the mainland somehow reached these islands, under the different geographical conditions and food shortages of different islands, they could slowly change over millions of years and separate into entirely new species different from each other. European explorers' expeditions brought those genius observers, especially Charles Darwin, to these islands, who compared the patterns on the beaks of birds, asked very uncomfortable questions that tore down old dogmas saying, "Why are these animals like this?" and carried these big questions in their heads to the whole world with books. Those lonely islands also forced people to look very, very closely at nature. Because when you are stranded on an arid island in the middle of the ocean, so far from home, from everything you know, every tiny detail is important to survive. From which coastline to enter the sea, where the fresh water and food sources are, and the behavior of the local wildlife, like giant tortoises, cease to be just a matter of curiosity for you. They suddenly become vital sources of information that can decide whether you will survive on that island or not. As time went on, the Galapagos Islands gained a justified worldwide reputation as a legendary place where massive scientific revolutions could start from very, very small and seemingly ordinary observations. The thickness of a finch bird's beak, the habit of an iguana eating algae underwater, how a cactus species distributed to the islands. Enduring that terrible sea journey to reach all of these was a part of that scientific lesson. Isolation can incredibly concentrate a person's scientific insight in their mind. Distance and being cut off from civilization can sharpen that naturalist's attention like a razor. A remote archipelago reached only with great effort and sweat can return that information to you that will travel to all the universities in the world and rewrite everything. The eruption of the Krakatoa volcano was so violent that even ships struggling with storms in the open sea recorded the shockwaves in all their horror. When Krakatoa, Indonesia, erupted, this disaster wasn't just limited to the island it was on and the geography around it. Ships sailing in the sea, hundreds of kilometers away from the volcano, witnessed this massive explosion. They didn't do this out of curiosity or by choice, but because the ocean carried the discomfort of that massive disaster to them via waves, they had to witness it. Sailors at sea wrote things like a doomsday scenario in their logbooks, deferring explosion sounds that resembled thunder, a terrible darkness suddenly falling in broad daylight, and strange giant waves that didn't behave like in ordinary storms but acted as if they were moving the ocean. Some ship crews felt how the pressure wave in the air hit their eardrums, and some unlucky ships encountered floating pumice stones, sponge stone, vomited by the volcano, completely covering the surface of the sea and turning the ocean into a sandy, abrasive, unstable surface moving. The sea itself became a giant messenger transmitting deadly tsunamis rapidly over vast distances and making even coastal lines resting peacefully at the other end of the ocean, far from that volcano, suddenly a part of that disaster. These observations and times in the logbooks taken from ships were so important, because in that era, none of the land-based instruments, seismographs, etc., that would measure earthquakes and volcanoes were on those islands, and those ships were the only record capturing the timing of the wave, the direction of the explosion, and the scale of the tsunami wave in the ocean. Moreover, these records showed us how terrifyingly connected nature and ocean hazards are to each other. A volcano erupting on land, by pushing the water mass, can bring massive destruction to trade shipping routes, ports hundreds of nautical miles away, and very distant shores. If you think about it for expedition history, this is a very harsh reminder that the sea is not just a passive waterway you pass over. The ocean is a living system that moves that massive shock energy inside it, as well as the ships on it. When the Earth's crust goes crazy and reshapes itself, the ocean helps spread that bad news much, much earlier and at a much more devastating speed than the telegrams sent and official reports written by authorities. The first census of marine life was a massive project that started with the merging of separate journeys made by scientific ships from thousands of different countries. No single research ship in the world, even if it traveled for years, could find and catalog all that living diversity of the ocean alone, because what you call the sea is so big, so deep, and every meter is so diverse it boggles the mind. That's why a global census of marine life, had to be put together, just like a giant patchwork quilt, by merging the seawater samples, animal observation records, chips, tags, attached to fish, and records of ecosystems obtained over years collected by thousands of different expeditions setting out from all four corners of the world. Every expedition setting out to sea added just a few small colored tiles to this giant mosaic painting, and decades later this painting slowly turned into a work of art telling what the ocean life in the world looked like. Researchers learn with astonishment how the biological diversity, meaning life, in the oceans concentrated only in certain places, like coral reefs, where the thousands of kilometers long migration routes of giant creatures like whales passed, and how living ecosystems separated from each other between shallow coasts, open waters of the ocean, and those pitch-dark deep regions. This joint effort also revealed what we didn't know about the oceans. Thousands of new and strange marine species were still waiting to be named. Human-made probes hadn't even entered many regions of the ocean yet. They were undersampled, and most of those detected migration patterns had already started to deviate from the route along with the climate and changing seasons messed up by humans. This is exactly what makes this effort where all countries united so fascinating. It turns competitive sea exploration into a massive and peaceful scientific collaboration happening between different oceans, different countries, and decades. The census wasn't just about finding new fish species and giving them Latin names. It was about understanding the relationships of creatures in the ocean, how abundant which species was, and what changed with the climate crisis. When you start recording and counting that huge life in the sea, you also start to realize with horror for the first time what is actually being erased and disappearing from the ocean forever. That's why this global ocean census, for scientists, can simultaneously feel like a celebration of nature and slap you in the face like the warning of an approaching apocalypse. The Terra Oceans project skipped the giant whales and sampled only tiny plankton, literally rewriting the massive family trees of the ocean from top to bottom. The living thing you call plankton can hardly be seen with a microscope. Hundreds of them can live in a single drop of water, but despite this, they form the foundation of all those wild food webs in the ocean, and they are the real bosses affecting that massive air, oxygen, we breathe in the atmosphere. The Terra Oceans project approached these tiny microscopic drifters tossed around by the wind on the surface of the sea with a great seriousness, as if they deserved a giant exploration expedition. As if they were looking for a bait whale or a shark. They collected millions of plankton samples from every region of the world, from icy waters to warm seas. Scientists in the laboratories on the ship analyzed the genetic DNA materials, gene sequences, of these creatures, finding a surprising biological diversity and unexpected connections between tiny organisms that look identical under the microscope but are actually not closely related genetically at all. In some cases, these genetic results completely reshaped the way those big scientists classified life in the sea and drew family trees, because genetic codes clearly revealed hidden evolutionary branches that traditional microscope observation could never see and understand. This huge expedition also highlighted how plankton communities, those tiny creatures, adapted by changing places with temperature changes, nutrient ratios in the water, and currents in the ocean. This made those microscopic creatures the most sensitive early warning alarms, indicators, of the ocean for measuring the climate crisis and environmental changes. The thing that forces the human mind and is unbelievable here is that terrible scale difference. A single jar of seawater you take from the ocean can house a whole universe of life inside where they actually fight each other, interact, hunt, live as parasites, and cooperate. By systematically jarring this microscopic universe for months, the Terra Oceans expedition helped uncover a giant and invisible living network that shelters the world's fishing, the carbon cycle, and the actual health of the ocean. This is the most modern, highest point of expedition history. You travel the whole world in a giant sailing ship, then you turn around and see that the biggest and most staggering secrets you found were hidden inside cells much smaller than a single grain of sand on the beach. Ocean expeditions found literal plastic even in the deepest trenches of the world, which were once thought to be completely pure and untouched by human hands. During those long and ignorant years, the deepest and darkest trenches of the ocean like the Mariana Trench were considered unreachable and isolated places, as if protected by an impassable wall created by nature itself. Reaching that bottom of the ocean requires special titanium-coated submarines, million-dollar budgets, and extremely careful engineering planning. That's why imagining those dark and distant places as clean and pure, free from human pollution, by default was a very comforting and tempting thought for us. But the exploration submarines that recently went down shattered our sweet dream by finding human-made plastic packaging debris and microplastics embedded in the structure of the mud, even in the thin mud of that Hadal Zone, deadly depth, the deepest place in the world. This deep discovery is not just demoralizing or sad, but also very illuminating, like a slap in the face. Because it clearly shows how ocean currents, small particles slowly sinking from the surface, and fish eating each other, food webs, can take a piece of human trash we throw on the ground on the street and carry it to even the most isolated, darkest, and most unreachable environments on the Earth's surface. It reframes pollution from being a one-dimensional problem like a few plastic bottles washing up on the beach, to a massive, three-dimensional crisis reaching the deepest part of the ocean. That plastic bag on the street doesn't just stay close to the shore or drift innocently on the surface of the water. It travels across oceans, slowly breaks down into micro pieces, and sneaks into those fragile bottom ecosystems that take thousands of years to recover and heal once damaged. When scientists take mud samples from extreme depths kilometers under that ocean and look at them in the laboratory, finding the packaging traces of the wafer we eat daily, the emotional and moral scale of the responsibility humanity gives to this world suddenly changes. The ocean can masterfully hide some shameful things, trash, from our eyes in its own massive depths. But even the deepest trenches cannot protect and hide themselves from our endless consumption habits. That massive trench, which once symbolized the magnificent mystery of the unknown ocean, now only symbolizes how far pollution can reach. It became proof of how disgustingly human impact and destruction can reach even that unreachable darkness. The desperate search for the MH370 plane at the bottom of the ocean became one of the largest and most detailed scanning operations in human history. When that huge MH370 passenger plane belonging to Malaysia Airlines disappeared with hundreds of people, the Indian Ocean suddenly turned into a vast, massive crime scene investigation, leaving almost no obvious clues around. Search and rescue teams coming from all four corners of the world had to combine the last faint signal data sent by satellites in orbit, those complex computer models of how the plane's parts would drift in ocean currents, deep underwater sonar mapping, and advanced submarine robots in massive ocean areas. The size and cost of this search effort were truly astonishing, but this wasn't because ships were chasing a visible piece of wreckage floating on the water. On the contrary, it was this hard because they were literally trying to find a needle in a haystack at the bottom of that dark sea floor that seemed to have no end. Every new search pass made by sonars dangled from ships produced brand new underwater terrain maps of those volcanic mountains, cliffs, and valleys underwater that none of us had actually mapped in such detail until that day, which inevitably turned that heartbreaking human tragedy into a massive geographical exploration. This study also threw it in all our faces how maddeningly difficult it is to search and scan the deep ocean even though we have modern navies. Bad weather conditions prevent sonar devices from being lowered into the sea, billion-dollar equipment can malfunction and break down under saltwater pressure, and the fact that every small bump reflected on the sonar screen could be an underwater mountain, an old shipwreck, or the plane's tail, or a big nothing, drives people crazy trying to interpret the data. This search mission became a lesson in coping with patience and uncertainty against nature despite our technology. And it showed us how the ocean can still easily hide its secrets at the bottom of its dark waters even in an age with so many spy satellites hovering above our heads. Furthermore, it also showed how humanity will desperately sacrifice its technology, billions of dollars, and years to reach an answer if there is hope, even when the sea offers us nothing but a dark silence. Modern ROVs, remotely operated underwater vehicles, work and explore for hours in pitch darkness, guided from the deck of a bright, sunny ship. An ROV, remotely operated vehicle, can go down thousands of meters into the black water where the massive water pressure crushes even steel submarines and a human's lungs would pop in seconds. It carries HD cameras, giant illumination lights, robotic arms, and sensitive scientific sensors on it. Then it instantly sends those magnificent images and data it sees through a fiber optic cable, tether, to the research ship on the surface. This event creates a truly weird reality that splits a person's brain in two, split. On the deck of the ship, in the clean ocean air, people sitting in the control room watching bright TV monitors while drinking their coffee, while the machine they control moves slowly in a freezing cold and pitch dark water kilometers below, where the only light comes just from its own lamps. The ROV pilots holding those joysticks learn to use that robot very, very delicately, like a surgeon, because a small and sudden wrong movement made under that pressure can stir up that fine mud on the sea floor and cover the cameras with a blinding dust cloud, or instantly crush a very fragile sea creature that has grown over thousands of years. With those robotic steel arms, pilots can grab and collect rocks from the sea floor, fill delicate organisms into tubes with the precision of tweezers, or examine the wooden planks of sunken old shipwrecks with a millimeter precision that old divers and explorers could not even see in their dreams. ROV cameras also completely changed from top to bottom who could participate in ocean exploration. Now not only sailors, but scientists sitting in universities on land, students in their schools, and even ordinary people on the internet can instantly watch those brand new discoveries at the bottom of the ocean live broadcast without ever setting foot on the sea themselves. This instant information sharing, immediacy, also completely reshapes the scientific discovery culture. That scary depth feels much closer to you and less distant while watching that live broadcast on the screen. Yet the ocean never accepts mistakes and continues to be very demanding, because every single hour that robot spends at the bottom of the ocean depends on the engineering on the ship, the perfect teamwork in the control room, and the great respect the pilot has for that wild environment that instantly punishes even tiny mistakes. Autonomous gliders quietly cross ocean basins like underwater kites slowly gliding beneath the water. An ocean glider doesn't roar through the water foaming with giant propellers behind it. It glides and surfs straight. The device sinks and rises in the ocean by adjusting its own weight, buoyancy force, with the oil and air tanks inside it. It turns this up and down vertical movement into a continuous, forward gliding movement thanks to those tiny wings on it. The resulting system is a silent journey that consumes almost no battery life, is efficient and can last for weeks or even months, traveling very long distances while constantly collecting water data. While traveling tirelessly for days, ocean gliders constantly measure the ocean's temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen in the water, and other scientific signals. They create a massive, moving picture, profile, showing the passage of seasons and the effects of storms underwater. Because they have no engine and are completely silent, they can also easily and secretly examine very sensitive areas where normal ship engine noise would disturb whales or marine life, or interfere with acoustic listening, sonar. They extend the reach of expeditions for free to areas where it is too dangerous to send ships and risk human lives, like the middle of hurricanes, or where it is too expensive to have a research ship patrol constantly. The real fascinating thing about these devices is that machine patience they have. A glider robot can continue to advance for months even when the people inside would need to sleep, eat, and see land and return, and it can silently monitor slow and gradual climate changes that a very short ship trip could never notice. This is a new kind of ocean expedition where a human doesn't stand by, an expedition where science and discovery are completely handed over to a persistent and silent machine that drifts underwater, constantly dives and surfaces, reports data to satellites, and continues to learn its environment. This system doesn't feel like an arrogance like forcibly conquering the ocean, but like patiently listening to the heart of the ocean over time. The first female oceanographers literally fought to get a bunk bed on ships, and when they succeeded, they changed the entirety of ocean science from the roots. They faced real obstacles that stood like a wall in the middle of their lives at that time, which would sound funny and absurd if I told you now. Some women were told that there was no special place reserved for their gender on research ships, or worse, the excuse was made that the presence of women would distract the male crew. Some old-fashioned captains even believed that a woman on a ship would bring bad luck and a curse. Even when these women got perfect degrees from universities and published massive scientific articles, their boarding of those research ships they loved so much could be blocked not by merit and success, but simply because of this stupid maritime tradition. Because of this, most of these brilliant women built themselves different alternative paths. When they couldn't get on ships, they examined the jars of water samples that men carried from the sea, took charge of the laboratories on land and managed them, and fought for stubborn policy changes that opened that research time spent at sea to more female researchers. When those petrified doors in front of opportunities finally cracked and they got on the ship, they didn't come there as guests or tourists. They came with brand new questions and brilliant minds that completely reshaped those old and rusted areas of ocean science. From studying plankton ecology to that deep chemical oceanography, sea floor mapping, and climate change studies. The story of these women is very, very important, because the history of ocean expeditions isn't just about how the seas wave. It's also about who is allowed to ask questions and do research about the ocean in the world. When more different voices reached the deck of that ship and the research laboratories, ocean science grew much bigger, sharpened, and finally became much more human-centric. Those maps drawn by Marie Tharp proved to the whole world the massive ridges and rifts at the bottom of the ocean, despite years of, "You're a woman, you don't understand," doubts thrown in her face. Tharp sat at her desk with thousands of sounding and sonar, depth, data that looked like just a typed, messy pile of numbers to many other people and scientists of that time. Then she took those mixed numbers and turned them into a highly logical, consistent, and hand-drawn massive sea-floor landscape. While sketching those depth profiles across the Atlantic Ocean on paper with her pencil, a persistent and very strange landform constantly began to appear, a massive underwater mountain range passing through the middle of the world, and a massive, collapsed Rift Valley, running right through the middle of that mountain. It was incredibly difficult to make the male scientific world of that era accept the idea that there was a continuous and massive rift constantly spewing lava at the bottom of the ocean. Even her boss initially called this idea girl talk, and her map interpretation was repeatedly rejected just because she was a woman, before it was even evaluated in detail on the desk. Still, Marie didn't give up. She continued to draw with her ruler, cross-check the numbers, and further detail her map. Years later, when her massive maps were matched with other scientific evidence like earthquake data, they helped prove to everyone the claim that the ocean seafloor wasn't just a static structure standing still, but on the contrary, a moving, dynamic crust. What makes her story so gripping and legendary is that she didn't make this discovery in the middle of a stormy sea or with a dramatic submarine dive. Her weapons were simply recognizing the patterns on paper, limitless patience, and an unshakable trust in the truth that the data full of numbers stubbornly told her. Marie's work shows us this. The greatest geographical discovery in the world can happen not at the bottom of the sea, but at a makeshift wooden desk, with a pencil and a tireless, stubborn honesty, and it can still single-handedly change the way humanity imagines the Earth. Indigenous compass-free wayfinding survived the oppression of colonialism and is being taught again on the open seas today. For many island and ocean cultures in the Pacific, seafaring and navigation were never just a simple, technical skill like knowing how to sail. It was their identity, their heritage left from their ancestors, and the existential memory of the whole society. When the colonialism of the Europeans crushed the culture of the local people, it broke this chain passed down from generation to generation. They replaced local knowledge, experience, and star reading with their own oppressive European routes and imported tools like compasses and maps. In many islands, missionaries even called these ancestral star and wind reading methods superstition and witchcraft, accused them of ignorance, and tried to ban them. Still, the art of wayfinding didn't give up and endured. It survived in the stories elders told children at night, in practices done secretly at sea, and in the memories of stubborn people who refused to let their culture sink to the bottom of the ocean and disappear completely. In the last 20-30 years, those revival, Renaissance, journeys made with traditional canoes and maritime training programs brought this ancient knowledge back into the public view of the world, without needing those compasses of Europe. Students learned to read the paths of stars on the horizon, the wave movements under the boat, and invisible winds directly from their masters through open ocean experience. These canoe journeys made completely without compasses in the ocean are not theatrical reenactments made for festivals. They are high proofs of competence in the sea by the local people, and acts of cultural restoration, taking back, of their stolen cultures. At the same time, they criticize and expand how we define science with our Western minds. Carefully observing the stars, seeing mistakes and repeating the route, and taking apprenticeship training from an experienced master, even if they live outside the laboratory walls of modern universities, they are extremely precise and flawlessly working scientific habits. This cultural revival reminds us that for thousands of years, the ocean has always been known not only by the compasses of the Europeans, but in multiple different ways, and that regaining those stolen ways of the locals can actually be a form of healing for humanity to make peace with nature. Lighthouse networks grew one after another on the coasts because a tiny, hidden reef could be enough to sink an entire fleet belonging to a kingdom. Long before GPS and those autonomous modern navigation aids, a dark coastline you didn't know could be a mousetrap waiting for your ship in silence and patience. Underwater reefs, dangerous shoals, and sand dunes that shifted with every storm, waited completely invisibly just below the surface until the ocean waves broke and foamed on those rocks, or the ship's boards cracked and split with a snap. Lighthouses became the illuminated answers to this terrifying fear of death for sailors. These weren't just romantic single towers built against the landscape. They were massive chain networks designed to guide ships safely through ocean approaches, mark unseen dangers in the dark, and create recognizable, rhythmic light patterns, flashes, that allowed captains to position the map in their heads at night. Every light that lighthouse emitted was a promise of hope. It told lost sailors in the dark, tossed around by storms in a moving world, there is a fixed and safe point here. Building them was an engineering nightmare in itself, very difficult and deadly dangerous. Some were erected on rocks in the middle of the sea, so desolate and pounded by ocean waves like a sledgehammer every second, that the construction crew carrying those stones there had to fight the weather trying to swallow them every moment as much as engineering while building the walls. The impact of those towers went far beyond just the safety of ships. This coastal navigation, which was reliable even in the dark, improved world trade, lowered insurance risk because fewer ships sank, and helped coastal port towns grow into massive cities. Lighthouses also shaped that cowardly expedition confidence inside sailors. When a ship finally returned after months of storms and scurvy disease in the open ocean, that familiar light rhythm shining through the dark was the first guaranteed sign that they had reached home and wouldn't die. These towers are often evaluated today in photos as romantic symbols of loneliness by poets or writers. Yet the actual real history of lighthouses is extremely practical, bloody, and urgent. They were built there because the ocean doesn't forgive the slightest mistakes and collects corpses, and at some point, people refused to accept this deadly loss as inevitable by saying it's fate, and decided to erect those towers. Marine quarantine stations shaped health policies in all ports long before how germs work. Germ theory even became widespread in the scientific world. Ports were the massive doors of countries opening to the world, and this also meant that the country was completely vulnerable to the outside. A ship crossing the oceans could bring cargo, spices, and enormous wealth to the port, but it could also bring the plague, cholera, or a new disease hiding inside the rats in its hold, which ravaged the city much faster than any sailor or doctor in those crowded, dirty streets could describe. Quarantine stations, lazarettos, emerged precisely as the first defense shield, infrastructure, protecting the city from death for this reason. Ships coming from the open ocean were imprisoned and kept waiting in the open sea or on special islands for 40 days. The passengers on board were inspected to see if they were diseased, and the goods on deck were aired for days, washed with vinegar, or burned and destroyed if there was a suspicion of disease. All of this was based on doctors developing primitive but practical ideas about germ and virus transmission, contagion and risk. Even if the people of that era didn't have microscopes or modern explanations, they could see the logic of what was happening and the patterns. Epidemics always followed the arrivals of those ships coming from outside. And keeping outsiders in isolation, quarantine, for a certain time reduced the spread of the disease to the city. These quarantine stations were usually extremely tense, irritable places full of endless fights, uncertainties, and fear between public safety, protecting the city, and trade, the spoiling of the goods on the ship. Also, these quarantine practices created the first early versions of today's modern public health management, ministries of health. Who in the state had the authority to forcibly detain a huge ship entering the country's port? How long a time was long enough to keep them in prison to be sure the disease had passed? What evidence did the doctor need to let the people go? Ocean travel forced societies to build mandatory legal roles for invisible enemies because of these microscopic but deadly threats coming from different continents. If you look at it throughout expedition history, the quarantine organization is a very creepy reminder that maritime exploration not only connects maps and trade, but also human bodies with diseases, and that every newly discovered brand new route can carry a disease from across the ocean. Astronomy calculations done on the ship's deck made star observatories portable and sharpened timekeeping standards for clocks around the world. Looking at those millions of stars above on a clear, pitch-dark night in the open sea can be incredibly amazing and romantic, but for the navigators managing that ship, that sky was also a cold workplace full of calculations. Those careful astronomical star observations made while rocking like a cradle with the waves at sea helped determine the ship's latitude, position, calibrate broken instruments like the compass, and check the accuracy of the chronometers, clocks, down to the second, which the crew relied on to survive in the middle of the ocean. Ships carried massive sextants, brass telescopes, and thick star chart tables in their hulls, turning those rocking decks into moving, floating observatories that had to work smoothly despite the wobbling wind and bursting salty spray. The effort to calculate in that darkness forcefully pushed measurement precision forward. The crew learned to standardize star measurement procedures, record the results consistently in the logbook from the deck, and compare these readings with other journeys made over the years. Ports and navies wanting to dominate the ocean demanded much more expensive and better chronometers, clocks, for their ships, more flawless star tables, and better astronomy education for captains in schools. Because in the vast sea, a tiny degree error made from the angle of that star looked at with a sextant could turn into a huge and deadly mistake where the ship smashed and hundreds of people drowned on a rocky coast full of reefs in the dark. In this way, the hardships of ocean expeditions inextricably strengthened the blood tie, partnership, between astronomy science and the sky and practical maritime navigation. The sky was no longer just a beautiful landscape to sit and watch for sailors. It was a massive, rotating coordinate reference system that saved lives. When thousands of sailors in different oceans of the world relied on the same celestial measurement methods to find exactly where they were, the clocks, timekeeping, in the world themselves became much more disciplined and tied to much more universal standards. The fear of being stranded in the middle of the ocean later helped drive the standards of synchronizing clocks, which supported everything from global continental mapping in the world to reliable scheduled programs of trade trains and ports. The Beaufort wind scale started as a practical, common language that everyone could understand to describe the force of the blowing wind. Because every person's feeling of the wind is different, when they use different words, it's blowing a bit, it's blowing very hard, for the same wind feeling, it is a complete mess and very difficult to measure the wind just with words and record it in the logbook or explain it to another ship. Admiral Sir Francis Beaufort changed this language confusion by inventing the Beaufort scale, linking the current force of the wind to clear observably physical effects on the sails or the sea. This way, a crew's report about the wind could be understood instantly by everyone without even needing massive expensive measuring instruments, anemometers, on the ship. Instead of vague definitions like light wind, moderate wind, that vary from person to person, sailors could define the weather conditions, scale from 0 to 12, according to the surface of the sea, foam status, and how much a ship with fully open sails leaned, what they did, at that moment. This system created a shared universal language understood instantly between those huge navies of countries and commercial fleets traveling the world, and perfectly improved pre-storm decision-making. A captain reading a weather forecast report or the daily entry of another ship could visualize the wind conditions there much more clearly, like a picture, in his head, and planners could compare the routes and seasonal winds in the port with less confusion. This 12-degree scale also made wind experience communicable to young sailors. For example, a young sailor who just started the profession could practically learn what a force 6 wind force meant to the ship by watching the wave behavior of the sea. Then he could carry this standard understanding he learned to any coastline in the ocean or another ship. Over time, the Beaufort scale jumped from ships to land and became a fundamental part of that modern meteorology science we know. Yet, the roots of this scale come incredibly, intensely from human fear. It was born from the need to communicate the approaching danger quickly and reliably to other ships and the Navy, and from experiences written in blood, in situations where a misunderstood or miscommunicated violent wind could break a huge mainmast in the middle of the sea, sink a commercial cargo, or cost the crew's lives. Sea shanties synchronized that heavy physical labor on the ship to the same rhythm and carried news on land from one port to another across oceans. On the deck of a sailing ship, many tasks require the perfect timing of the men to survive and do those heavy jobs. Pulling a soaking wet, thick and very heavy sail rope, lifting a massive wooden yardarm, or turning the giant winch, capstan, to drop the anchor, goes better and without loss not when the men's bodies struggle with scattered efforts each according to his own head, but only when everyone breathes in exactly at the same time and pulls at exactly the same time together. Sea shanties weren't sung for fun, they were work synchronization tools, built out of rhythm. A muscular song leader, shantyman, would call out a verse loudly, the crew would answer that song like a choir at the top of their lungs, and that shared musical pulse in between kept everyone continuing to pull the ropes at exactly the same second in the middle of the ocean. This sung coordination reduced the rate of ropes slipping from men's hands and breaking fingers, injuries, and incredibly increased the work efficiency on the ship, which is why these work songs spread from tongue to tongue among ships. These songs also carried the isolated culture of the sea to ports. The verses and lyrics of the songs were constantly changed according to the ports visited, the crew on that ship, and the stormy events they experienced. Thus, a single sailor song could become a moving, live bulletin board, carrying the gossip in that port, the grief for those who drowned at sea, and that rogue sailor humor from port to port. In that old world where newspapers and news traveled very slowly by horse carriage, sailors usually came to cafes with those war or trade stories in the ports long before official state letters or newspapers, and these famous songs helped preserve these stories in a catchy, poetic format. Sea shanties remind us of this. That huge history of ocean expeditions lives not only in official documents in libraries, but in the muscles on the shoulders of sailor men and in their voices shouting at the top of their lungs. The ocean always demanded muscle power, labor, with its massive winds, and this labor done like a slave created those legendary, sorrowful, and powerful musics that we still listen to on the internet today and still echo in our heads. The first global weather maps were built by gathering the scattered logbooks of ships crossing the ocean unaware of each other. Long before weather computers and satellites, a global view of the world's weather or storm cycles had to be put together by hand from the notebooks kept by ships in the middle of the ocean, rather than countless local observations on land. Ship logbooks meticulously recorded the direction of the winds, barometer pressure, cloud cover, and breaking storms every day in massive oceans where there was no land piece or meteorology station on the horizon. When these thousands of scattered records were gathered by officials in maritime administrations and compared on a desk, a massive weather pattern began to emerge across oceans, passing seasons, and different latitudes. Scientists and weather forecasters could finally identify the prevailing wind belts, trade winds, constantly blowing in the ocean, those destructive tracks of storms, hurricane paths, and those famous frequent calm zones, doldrums, where not a leaf stirred for months on the net. This information perfectly improved the route planning of new ships and reduced the risk of dying at sea, because captains could guess what kind of weather conditions they might encounter in the ocean ahead in which months before setting out, even if they couldn't guess the exact day that storm would break to the second. The creation of those large and colorful global weather maps also marks a very big change in maritime mentality. The individual storm experiences that captains previously kept to themselves now became a common dataset shared for the whole Navy. A storm that terrified an unlucky crew in the middle of the ocean and broke their masts became a small warning dot on a map when returning to port, becoming a lifesaver that could help another crew passing through that route later to avoid that same terrible fate. In expedition history, these meteorology maps are the most beautiful proof of collective learning where mankind helps each other. The ocean taught with winds, ships recorded this lesson with their blood, and society slowly learned to read that dark sky above the ocean with more confidence, using maps. Ocean expeditions usually returned to port not just with gold or maps, but with brand new words for the world. When people encounter those unusual wild landscapes at the other end of the world, weird animals they have never seen before, tools, and strange native traditions, the language they use inevitably has to stretch and expand to describe that new world. Expedition ships brought home much more than coordinates from across the ocean months later. They brought brand new names, borrowed loan words from natives, and brand new sailor meanings used for old terms to their own countries. Sometimes explorers directly adopted those local words, canoe, hammock, tobacco, etc., to describe that new animal or fruit they found, because their own languages didn't have an exact match. And sometimes they slapped made-up labels from their own heads onto that native thing they saw across the ocean, even if the local name sounded too clunky or prejudiced in their own language, and that name just stuck. These words coming from new continents, broke off from ship logbooks, leaked into large dictionaries over time through merchant barters in taverns and those noisy conversations in port cities where different cultures mixed daily. This process of acquiring words shaped how distant islands and exotic places were imagined in a fairy tale way by people on land who had never left their castle or village, never traveling in their lives. A made-up name can carry great admiration, a massive misunderstanding, or a terrible colonial power behind it, and can unknowingly influence the foreign policies and attitudes towards foreigners of kingdoms for generations. This is exactly why vocabulary, language, is incredibly important in expedition history. Language isn't just a neutral wrapping paper that describes goods. It is exactly a part of that colonial or explorer heritage coming across the ocean. A coastline mapped by a ship and named with a European name is easier to discuss in Parliament, easier to claim militarily, and much easier to mythologize when telling the public. Expeditions physically expanded the world, and at the same time, they forever expanded the words people use to keep that massive world in their minds and imagine it. The deepest ocean trenches in the world were named years before anyone actually physically saw them. For a long time, those deadly and deepest places of the ocean were known only by deductions, soundings, calculated from above and with an incredible patience. Exploration expeditions left heavy-sounding lines, ropes, into that pitch darkness of the sea and used echo measurements reflecting from sonar in later years, then compared these results with many other ship passages in the ocean to find the most extreme and dark depths of the ocean. The names of these deep pits were assigned at a desk to massive landforms that no human eye had ever witnessed directly live, which, if you think about it, is a wonderfully arrogant and brave thing a scientist can do. It's like naming a massive underwater valley you've never seen, maybe doesn't even exist, just based on how much further your measuring rope or sonar signal continues to drop into the sea. These given names carried the stories of the explorers of that era and jealous rivalries between countries. By naming that deep abyss, they not only marked their exploration achievements, honored their own research ships, like Challenger Duke, and claimed a kind of intellectual and national ownership over that pitch-dark unknown underwater valley. Only much, much later, developed deep underwater cameras and deep-diving research vehicles withstanding the pressure visually verified what the measurements calculated by hand in that darkness suggested. This historical sequence is very important. In ocean history, unknown geographical information usually comes to humanity first as numbers and maps measured from the ship. The act of seeing physically with the eye comes in much later years when technology develops. Trenches were actually real on maps long before they were visible to the human eye. And that time gap between knowing with numbers at a desk and going down to the bottom of the sea and seeing it personally is one of the most breathtaking and fascinating tensions of ocean exploration. Those fine pencil sketches drawn during early exploration expeditions served as biology textbooks for landlocked European scientists who had never seen the sea in their lives. In those old times when cameras and photographs hadn't been invented yet or couldn't easily travel on the ocean, a very careful and detailed pencil drawing drawn on paper could be the fine difference between real scientific knowledge at the university and a made-up sailor rumor told in a tavern. Those talented artists and painters on expedition ships drew those weird fish caught in the net, exotic birds on distant islands, shells, and sea plants on paper with a massive urgency that blended their deep admiration and the responsibility of taking the right information to Europe. A big scientist sitting at home, in London, or at his university in Paris, might never see a living coral at the bottom of the ocean or a strange, toothy deep water prey caught in a net alive in his life. Yet, a drawing from the hand of that talented artist could preserve the shape, anatomical proportion, and basic biological features of that animal perfectly enough to do scientific study at the academy. These images drawn on the ship became a kind of portable ocean fieldwork, taken as evidence from the waters of distant seas and passed from hand to hand between dusty libraries and university lecture halls in Europe. The best expedition artists on these ships learned to capture those dull details as close to reality as possible without turning the animals from the ocean into mythological dragons or something, fantasy, and they had to work very quickly, because the animal samples in salt water or alcohol in the barrel quickly rotted from the heat and those vibrant colors faded and turned gray within hours. The drawings also preserved the environmental context in the ocean, not just the animal. A drawn island coastline profile could show where and under which rock that weird creature was found, and a coral reef landscape scene could clearly show someone who didn't understand seafaring around what kind of rocks ocean life clustered. The ocean entered science exactly with these papers, in this way, for those arrogant European Academy people who never left those distant shores and stepped on soil. Those thin pencil lines drawn on the ship became massive stepping stones conveying distance across thousands of kilometers of ocean to science. Sea ice maps in polar seas used to be just a compass that saved ships from being crushed, but today they have become massive archives for early climate research. In those freezing polar waters, the ice on the sea is not just a romantic background scenery to be watched from the outside. That ice is a moving, deadly disaster that can instantly trap a research ship, crush even steel ships like paper with its massive pressure, or completely block the route back home for weeks. Early polar explorers started recording very meticulously the sharp edges of the ice masses, the open water channels between the ice and the ocean, leads, and the times when that sea froze and suddenly broke and shattered into pieces, because a single wrong assumption on that ice could end the whole journey at the bottom of the ice. These ice maps drawn by captains with their own hands were practical survival tools passed from hand to hand among captains who understood very well that memory alone was not enough in that freezing cold while struggling with the polar sea, and that they had to note down what they saw instantly. Over years and decades, these records accumulating in drawers transformed into something completely different, miraculous later on. Even if the men of that era didn't know it, they became an unintentional, perfect archive of the changing conditions of the ocean and the climate. In later years, when modern climate researchers compared those yellowed old maps with the newer observations of modern satellites, they could clearly see the shifts in the timing of the ice freezing and the massive area it covered, extent, and this directly pointed to the broader, global warming and climate patterns we have today. A logistics document scribbled hurriedly just to survive in that freezing sea in the beginning was put on the table a century later as more than the biggest climatological evidence of climate science. This is actually a very common, weird theme of expedition history. People write only what they have to in order not to die while in the middle of the ocean, but when future generations find those notes, they read a massive history telling how the world has changed, not just a logbook. Those ice maps show us the ocean both as a threat wanting to swallow the ship, and silently as a witness to a century of climate change, and remind us in a legendary way that a simple collected data can actually live much longer than the life or death crisis that produced it at that moment. The first full tours taken around the world radically changed people's diets, languages, and local trade in every port they visited. A full tour taken around the world with a sailboat was not just a geographical line drawn with a pencil around a world globe. Everywhere those ships docked and anchored, it was a moving, living exchange that forever reshaped the daily life of that island and port. That crew touring the world carried the food preferences they were used to in their own hometowns, cooking techniques, and what they cravings, with them across the ocean, then encounter completely new ingredients and exotic tastes their tongues had never known on the islands they anchored at. Spices from India, those preserved goods of Europe, and those juicy, weird fruits they weren't familiar with entered people's daily diets across the oceans by ships. These spread sometimes just as luxury things decorating the tables of the rich, and sometimes as a necessity that saved lives in the port, keeping sailors away from diseases like scurvy. Languages changed too, of course. Sailors picked up working routines, weird street insults, curses, tavern jokes, and cunning bargaining words in the markets from the locals in the ports they went to, then pulled anchor and carried them forward like stowaways in their mouths to the next port. Trade in the ports followed exactly the same pattern too. If a port in the middle of the ocean gained a reputation for good supplies or repairs for ships, it could become a central part of that massive world circuit loop, constantly repeated by ships touring the world, and that global circuit turned those small local economies engaged only in fishing into massive trade centers. Still, this culture and goods exchange was never friendly and equal. This power and wealth usually traveled with the cannons, threats, and forced exploitation contracts next to those ships, and many local goods were taken from the locals at gunpoint and by force. Yet, even if bloody, that global cultural change is undeniable. When ships started drawing circles around the world constantly, they actually started throwing that whole big world into a giant cauldron and stirring it, stopping at only one port each time. The sensitive marine clocks on board standardized time zones around the world long before radio time signals were even invented. Before telephones or instant communication, time was surprisingly just a local event of that village or that city, contrary to what you might think. Noon in the town happened only when the sun reached its highest point in the sky of that town, and this was more than enough for most villages or towns. Nobody cared about the time of another city. However, ocean travel forced a different and ruthless discipline. Navigators trying to find their direction in the open sea desperately needed reliable timekeeping that wouldn't deviate on the ship, so they could compare positions by looking at the stars and hit arrival schedules across long longitude distances, knowing the time of the port they left down to the second. Those sensitive clocks and chronometers on the ships became the absolute authorities on the ship that everyone obeyed without objection, from that cool officer observing from the sky to the lowest-ranking crew changing watch in the lower deck. As ocean journeys connected very distant ports more regularly, the need for a shared time agreement between the two countries grew crazily. The timetables of shipping vessels, port operations that would unload the ship, and later the train connections departing from the ports benefited incredibly from that global agreement on what time it was supposed to be. That strict clock practice on the ship helped push this global agreement forward towards land, because sailors lived by the exact same standardized clock routines down to the second inside the ship, even while traveling in changing time zones and longitudes. In the vast sea, the changing day itself could feel weird as time on that long journey. It was carefully recorded in the logbook, but when you returned, the day you lived didn't always match the calendar your family on land was expecting, because you sailed west. The pressure to coordinate time between ports and use the same clock laid the foundation on the ships themselves for the broader standardization of time zones in the world, long before radio signals instantly broadcast the official time moment, beat-bit, across the oceans. Depth soundings around Antarctica showed that those continental shelves actually hid massive valleys carved out by ancient glaciers. When research expeditions started measuring the freezing depths around the Antarctica continent with ships, they surprisingly found that those shallow edges on the coast were not flat, smooth ramps down to the depth of the ocean. Soundings, depth-measuring leaded ropes, thrown from the boat revealed incredibly complex shapes underwater, including wide and deep grooves cutting right into the continental shelf like they were cut with a saw. These massive hidden valleys underwater suggested a very powerful past movement. Those massive ice sheets on the continent, when extending outward from the sea, actually acted like slow-moving giant bulldozers, grinding, carving, and digging deep valleys into the sea floor beneath them. The idea that ancient ice from old eras could carve and reshape not only the land, but also that sunken, hidden terrain underwater, made the Antarctica continent feel much wilder and dynamic in our eyes, even in its seemingly silent and dead stillness. For explorers at the poles, this discovery added deadly and brand new stakes to the mapping business. A glacier shelf that looks flat and uniform on a small scale when viewed from the ocean surface can hide massive and dangerous features underwater that affect ocean currents, sea ice movement, and the sliding behavior of large glaciers into the sea even today. Also, measuring these soundings, depths, in that icy sea was literally an act of courage at the same time. Working near those ruthless Antarctica coasts means struggling to the death with the sudden weather exploding and the drifting giant ice masses trying to crush the ship every moment, while trying to make those fine measurements from the rocking boat that require stability and repeated attempts. Every depth reading taken in that freezing water helped uncover the story of a mass of ice that once reached much further towards the ocean, and a sea floor that still remembers the marks that ice carved into its bottom. The discovery of manganese nodules at the bottom of the ocean showed us how slow and patient geology is on the abyssal plains. When expedition research submarines or nets pulled samples from that deep, flat, and muddy sea floor, they sometimes found weird, round, and pitch-black lumps scattered in the sediment. These potato-like manganese nodules looked almost ordinary, like ordinary small stones you could pick up walking on a beach. Yet the way those stones formed at the bottom of the ocean is far, far from ordinary and is legendary. In that dark abyss where only sediments, mud, can fall very slowly, minerals in the sea water can accumulate layer by layer around a very small core piece, like a shark tooth or bone fragment, in an extremely slow manner, over incredibly long time frames of hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. Each nodule you hold in your hand is a record of silent chemistry and patience, built by ocean floor processes that don't need the world's loud earthquakes or erupting volcanoes to make progress. Their discovery completely changed people's imagination about the deep plains of the ocean. The abyss wasn't a featureless, empty, or barren void. It was a living landscape where subtle processes could build concrete, tangible objects, stones that grow over millions of years, even in near pitch darkness and freezing high pressure. Of course, humanity being humanity, these nodules also ignited wild debates among mining companies about resource extraction, mining, at the bottom of the ocean. Because a massive object that grows slowly over millions of years at the sea floor can become a mine commodity quickly removed with bulldozers and sold in the market in an instant. Ocean expeditions brought them up from the darkness just as a scientific curiosity at first. Then the world started debating what it would mean for nature to completely scrape them off the bottom of the ocean with one's own greed. Expeditions hunting for giant sea monsters from old legends in the oceans usually found giant squids and kept wondering about the mysteries of the deep. Since ancient times, sailors always told terrifying stories about massive, horrific tentacled shapes, like the kraken, that attacked sailboats and emerged from the water, and in that century, some scientific expeditions set out hoping to actually find and prove or disprove these monsters. When the deep nets thrown came up to the deck of the ship with massively sized, giant squids, the line between the legend in the taverns and scientific biology blurred in a very exciting way. A giant squid is obviously not a mythologically fire-breathing dragon, yet it is massive enough, weirdly shaped enough, and powerful enough to wrap a boat, to explain why people once talked about tentacled terrors with such fear. These giant animals live in that pitch-dark deep water where human eyes can rarely go, which means most encounters with humans happen not like a hunt, but only by accident. A giant squid can suddenly wash up dead on a shallow shore in a storm, be found torn apart in the stomach of a hunted sperm whale, or briefly surface near a ship by chance in the middle of the ocean and disappear back into the darkness to the bottom. Scientific expeditions collected the massive beaks of these monsters washing up on beaches, the sucker scar marks on the whales, and the occasional whole specimens caught. Then they argued for years among themselves with limited and incomplete evidence about how big these creatures could actually grow and their hunting behavior at the bottom of the ocean. Those mythological monster hunt stories didn't end with a shame or ignorance for the sailors. On the contrary, it left science alone with a better question: if creatures this huge, this dramatic and powerful can live unseen for centuries at the bottom of the ocean, beyond our routine reach, what else lives in those waters that our eyes cannot see? The scary monster stories became a curiosity-filled gateway opening to the real deep-sea mystery of the ocean. Marine archaeology is now finding submerged ancient ports at the bottom of the ocean, proving how coastlines have actually moved and sunk over time. Sometimes the ocean preserves the ruins of human history much better and intact than the windy and eroding land. Underwater surveys and excavations done by divers have uncovered moss-covered sunken temple walls, giant port anchors, and harbor structures sitting on the ocean floor in what were once busy, crowded coastal areas where people walked and set up markets. Their desolate presence underwater is a very creepy reminder that the coastlines we trust and build houses on are actually not fixed forever. Over millennia, the sea level can rise slowly, the landmass can sink with earthquakes, and violent storms can completely reshape the coasts, thus leaving all that human infrastructure, its streets and ports, stranded forever underwater, left to the fish. Finding an ancient port at the bottom of the sea is like walking on an old Roman city street in a place where fish now swim silently. It forces a person to look at the past from a very different, sad angle. People didn't always live on those safe shores shown by today's modern world maps, and the trade networks of that time touched places that are now submerged, at the bottom of the ocean. Of course, marine archaeology requires a much more careful technique than digging with a brush on land. Bottom currents dragging you in the water, low visibility that drops to zero when the mud rises, and fragile materials that have rotted over thousands of years, mean that historical site can easily be destroyed and damaged in seconds by a careless or rough diver's hand. That's why the best underwater expeditions treat these sunken city locations not as treasure piles to extract loot from, but with respect as underwater historical archives that need to be preserved. Every wet artifact or pottery extracted is a clue dropped into the ocean about old trade, daily life, and technology. And that sea floor surrounding it can hold that original context, which land excavations usually lose with the wind, exactly where it is, like a time capsule. The ocean here ceases to be just a subject of exploration, it also becomes the greatest curator, museum attendant, of that human memory and history it sank. Believe it or not, the making of every new ocean map still begins with that same simple, ancient act, sending a measurement line down from the ship. Modern research ships can paint, map, the sea floor in 3D in seconds with multi-beam sonar systems and extremely sophisticated electronic sensors. Yet, the very heart, essence, of that map-making task still beats with the oldest possible way, that primitive question asked by sailors, exactly how deep is it right here? Humanity's earliest answer to the ocean was a simple, weighted line, rope, with lead attached to the end, lowered down from the boat until they felt it hit the bottom. That action in the water created the first honest, physical contact between a ship and that pitch-dark, unseen world beneath it. That rope-dropping business also created science's verification discipline. A map is not just an imagination made up from a head. It is a measurement repeated stubbornly until it agrees completely with itself, until it is certain of its accuracy. Even now, in this age of modern satellites, device calibration and of ground truth on site are still very, very important. Sensor instruments are checked, sonar readings are compared, and to confirm the accuracy of that weird shape suggested by that expensive remote sensing on the computer, mud sample, grab, is taken directly from the bottom of the sea. That fancy romance of ocean exploration usually focuses on sailing very far away, to new horizons, but this is the quieter, labor truth of the matter. New knowledge learned about the ocean usually begins with just a single point being measured very carefully and tirelessly. Drop the line into the sea. Record the depth when it hits the bottom. Pull the rope up and repeat this in another place. Massive oceans turn into maps only through these countless, boring, and small acts of attention, measurement, and this stubborn tradition connects today's million-dollar modern expeditions by heart to those earliest ones, to the first explorers in those wooden boats. As we come to the end of our journey, you might notice how vast and boundless the ocean feels in your eyes now, not just as salty water, but as a massive human history. We set sail with those fearless early navigators who trusted the stars, the invisible winds, and only their memories. We followed massive empires that treated those dangerous sea routes like veins, arteries, carrying the world's food, languages, and colonial power from one port to another. We watched how old compasses and tools turned the terrifying uncertainty of the sea into coordinates on maps. And we deeply felt how a single invention, the steam engine, the chronometer, could suddenly make all those horizons called unreachable, reachable in an instant. We drifted to the polar edges, to the abyss, where the ice never negotiated with ships and were surviving in that icy hell depended only on patience, teamwork, and bitter knowledge learned the hard way. We dove into those pitch-dark depths where the sea floor revealed its volcanic ridges, dark trenches, and that strange and alien life that developed with sulfur, completely without sunlight. And we saw how modern research expeditions, while the ocean quietly maintains its own slow pace, are still chasing how great mysteries, from lost airplane wrecks to hidden ecosystems at the bottom of the sea. If you are still awake right now and want to take another slow, calm journey like this into the past, there will be another video waiting for you on the screen. You can just let it play, autoplay, and continue to follow that curious thread of exploration wherever it takes you, without thinking at all. And if this episode brought you that calm, relaxing curiosity you were looking for, you might want to like the video, subscribe, or leave a small comment below. This really helps the channel land in a softer and calmer place, and reach more sleepy listeners who need to shake off the exhaustion of the day. But for now, you have absolutely no need to check any route or navigate, find your way, anything anymore. Let the tense muscles in your jaw relax. Let your tired shoulders drop down to the bed. Feel your breath finding a much easier and slower rhythm in and out, just like a tide wave hitting the shore that knows exactly where it belongs. Imagine that last daylight fading softly behind a quiet and dark horizon, and a stable, sturdy ship moving straight forward with the wind, without expending any effort